for our part, remains committed to working with our partners in the Council to resolve the conflict through a political solution. There must be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, whether that is in Syria or on the streets of Salisbury. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
What proportion is it estimated of the chemical weapons infrastructure that Syria has that was destroyed or degraded last night? Is there any sense of that?
Well, I think there will be separate military briefings coming later from the three capitals involved, so I will allow that to take place. But I will tell you that it was a limited strike with a targeted objective, and I think that's a very important factor.
Ambassador,
So I'm going to take this person first.
You've touched upon this in your remarks, but could you spell out for us the legal basis for these strikes?
Well, I will set that out in the Council in full. We have published it on our website here in New York, and it has been published by the government in London on the government website. But in a nutshell, it was to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the people of Syria, which has been exacerbated by the use of chemical weapons. In the British government's view, in truly exceptional circumstances, it is right to have a humanitarian exemption, and international law does not prohibit this where it is to alleviate humanitarian distress, particularly on the scale we have seen in Syria.
Ambassador, should we wait any new strikes in Syria?
I'm sorry?
Should we wait any new strikes?
I don't have any comment to make on further strikes.
Ambassador, President Trump said he was considering a sustained response, that they would strike again if chemical weapons were used again. Is Britain on board with that as well?
We stand full square with President Trump and President Macron. This is a P3 action. We will stay in very close touch with our allies about next steps.
Ambassador, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has questioned the legality of these strikes. You are certain about the legality?
Yes, we are certain. Thank you for asking, but the government is very certain. Thank you very much.
Hey, how are you? Huh? So, I think so. If he has time.
I know it's hard yeah. Thank you.
Was it legal?
Declaro abierta la sesión número 8233 del Consejo de Seguridad. En el orden del día provisional para esta sesión figura el siguiente tema: amenazas a la paz y seguridad internacionales, la situación en el Medio Oriente. Queda aprobado el orden del día. De conformidad con el artículo 37 del reglamento provisional del Consejo, invito al representante de la República Árabe Siria a participar en esta sesión. Así queda acordado. El Consejo de Seguridad iniciará ahora el examen del tema 2 del orden del día. Deseo dar una cordial bienvenida al secretario general, excelentísimo señor Antonio Guterres, a quien le doy la palabra.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I have been following closely the reports of airstrikes in Syria conducted by the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. Last night, at 22 hours of New York, the US President announced the beginning of airstrikes with participation by France and the UK, indicating they were targeting the chemical weapons capabilities of the Syrian government and to deter their future use. His statement was followed by announcements from Prime Minister May and President Macron. The airstrikes were reportedly limited to 3 military locations inside Syria. The first target included the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center at Al-Mazah Airport in Damascus. The second, an alleged chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. And the third, an alleged chemical weapons equipment storage site and command post also near Homs. The Syrian government announced surface-to-air missile response activity. Both US and Russian sources indicated there were no civilian casualties. The UN is, however, unable to independently verify the details of all these reports. Mr. President, as Secretary General of the United Nations, it is my duty to remind Member States that there is an obligation, particularly when dealing with matters of peace and security, to act consistently with the Charter of the United Nations and with international law in general. The UN Charter is very clear on these issues. Mr. President, the Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I call on the members of the Security Council to unite and exercise that responsibility. And I urge all members to show restraint in these dangerous circumstances and to avoid any acts that could escalate matters and worsening the suffering of the Syrian people. As I did yesterday, I stressed the need to avoid the situation from spiraling out of control. Mr. President, any use of chemical weapons is abhorrent. The suffering it causes is horrendous. I have repeatedly expressed my deep disappointment that the Security Council failed to agree on a dedicated mechanism for effective accountability for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I urge the Security Council to assume its responsibilities and fill this gap. And I will continue to engage with Member States to help achieve this objective. A lack of accountability emboldens those who would use such weapons by providing them with the reassurance of impunity. And this in turn further weakens the norm proscribing the use of chemical weapons and the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a whole. Mr. President, the seriousness of the recent allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Duma requires a thorough investigation using impartial, independent and professional expertise. I reaffirm my full support for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, and its fact-finding mission in undertaking the required investigation. The team is already in Syria. I am informed that their operations plan to visit the site is completed and that they are ready to go. I am confident they will have full access without any restrictions or impediments to perform their activities. Mr. President, allow me to repeat what I said yesterday. Syria today represents the most serious threat to international peace and security. In Syria, we see confrontations and proxy wars involving several national armies, a number of armed opposition groups, many national and international militia, foreign fighters from everywhere in the world, and various terrorist organizations. From the beginning, we have witnessed systematic violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international law tout court in utter disregard of the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. For 8 long years, the people of Syria have endured suffering upon suffering. Syrians have lived through a litany of horrors, atrocity crimes, sieges, starvation, indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, the use of chemical weapons, forced displacement, sexual violence, torture, detention, and enforced disappearances. The list goes on. At this critical juncture, I call on all members to act consistently with the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including the norms against chemical weapons. If the law is ignored, it is undermined. There is no military solution to the crisis. The solution must be political. We must find ways to make credible progress towards a genuine and credible political solution that meet the aspirations of the Syrian people to dignity and freedom in accordance with Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communiqué. I've asked my special envoy to come to New York as soon as possible to consult with me on the most effective way to accelerate the political process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias al señor secretario general por la valiosa información que ha proporcionado. Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen formular declaraciones. Doy la palabra al representante de la Federación de Rusia.
Thank you, sir. Russia called for this urgent meeting of the Security Council to discuss the aggressive actions of the United States and their allies against Syria. This is the 5th meeting on this topic just this week. The President of the Russian Federation, Putin, made a special statement today, and I will quote him. On the 14th of April, the United States, supported by its ally, launched an airstrike against military and civilian targets of the Syrian Arab Republic. Without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council, and in violations of UN Charter and norms and principles of international law, an aggression against a sovereign state was carried out, which is on the front line in the fight against terrorism. Just as 1 year ago, when the Shire Air Base in Syria came under attack, the United States used as a pretext a staged chemical attack against civilians. This time in Duma, Damascus suburb, Russian military experts did not find any traces of chlorine or any other toxic agent when they visited the site. Not a single local resident was able to confirm that a chemical attack had actually taken place. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons dispatched its experts to Syria in order to investigate all the circumstances. However, in a sign of cynical disdain, a group of Western countries decided to take military action without waiting for the results of the investigation. Russia condemns in the strongest possible terms the attack against Syria, where Russian military personnel are assisting the legitimate government in its counterterrorism efforts. Through its actions, the United States makes an already catastrophic humanitarian situation in Syria even worse and brings suffering to civilians. In fact, the U.S. panders to the terrorists who have been tormenting the Syrian people for 7 years, leading to a wave of refugees fleeing this country and the region. The current escalation around Syria is destructive for the entire system of international relations. History will deliver its verdict, and Washington already bears a heavy responsibility for the bloody outrage in Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. End of quote. Russia has done everything possible to convince the United States and its allies to refrain from their military plans, which could lead to a new spiral of violence in Syria and destabilize the Middle East. The Secretary General of the UN, at the meeting of the Security Council that we convened yesterday and today, has expressed his concern about the way events have developed. However, in Washington, London, and Paris, preferred to disregard calls to appeals to common sense. The United States and its allies continue to demonstrate blatant disregard for international law. Although as permanent members of the Security Council, they must be especially firm in protecting the provisions of the UN Charter. It was shameful to hear how, in justifying the aggression, an article of the U.S. Constitution was mentioned. Now we have the greatest respect to the right of each state to respect their own founding law. However, Washington should learn, it's time for Washington to learn that the International Code of Behavior regarding the use of force is regulated by the United Nations Charter. It's interesting how the people of Great Britain and France, what they will think that when they find out that their government is taking part in an illegal military adventure by referring to the American Constitution. You're constantly tempted by neocolonialism. You have nothing but disdain for the UN Charter and the Security Council, which you are unjustifiably trying to use for your illicit aims. There's no serious work that you're doing in the Security Council. You don't consult us, and you mendaciously claim otherwise. You undermine the authority of the Security Council. As a pretext for aggression, you mentioned the alleged use of chemical weapons in the Syrian city of Douma. Representatives of Russia, after an inspection by our experts, unequivocally stated that no such incident took place. Furthermore, there were people found who took part in this staging. And in fact, the inspirers and organizers of that staging were foreign intelligence services. After this event, the Syrian authorities immediately invited experts from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons so that they conduct a field mission to Douma in order to establish the facts. Quickly, visa formalities were resolved and guarantees of security were provided. At the time the strikes were conducted, experts were already in Syria and getting ready to begin their work. I want to recall to the members of the Security Council and everyone else that on the 10th of April, when our draft resolution on secure work of the special mission of the OPCW was blocked, we were assured of the fact that such a document was not necessary. We were told that the mission, without any additional efforts by the Security Council, will go visit the site, and it is clear that we were absolutely right. Yesterday, some of our colleagues, some of them naively, some of them cynically, told us that the reason of the situation is supposedly a lack of an independent investigative mechanism. The aggression has shown that that is not the issue at all, as we stated. During last year's attack against the Chirac air base, there was the joint investigative mechanism of the UN OPCW that did not prevent the United States from conducting a missile strike. Afterwards, the JIM, in fact, made sure that its conclusions coincided with the reasons for the American strike. We have said many times, you don't need any investigations. You didn't need them then, and you don't need them today.
Организаторы агрессии не стали дожидаться даже элементарного установления фактов международной организации, которая уполномочена этим заниматься. Они сами все якобы установили и сразу назначили виновных. После того, как сами же с помощью подопечных им боевиков и карманных НПО распустили через социальные сети подкрепили мифическими секретными разведданными. Господа маски, а точнее белые каски, в очередной раз сброшены. Мы уже привыкли, что при реализации своих сомнительных геополитических установок страны-агрессора заведомо во всех грехах обвиняют режим Асада. В последнее время появилась мода сваливать ответственность на Россию, которая в их изложении не может сдержать диктатора. Все по отработанной схеме.
All this is based on a scheme that has been well tried as a provocation, as mendacious accusations, verdict, and punishment. This is how you want international affairs to be conducted now? This is hooliganism in international relations and not minor hooliganism, given that we're talking about major nuclear powers. Several strikes were conducted against the Scientific Research Center in Barza and Jamraya. Recently, 2 inspections by the OPCW were conducted with unimpeded access to all facilities. Experts didn't find any traces of activity that would contravene the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Научно-исследовательские учреждения в Сирии используются для сугубо мирной деятельности, направленной на повышение эффективности народного хозяйства. Вы хотите, чтобы в Сирии не осталось никакого народного хозяйства? Хотите отбросить в каменный век эту страну, которая еще несколько лет назад была одной из наиболее развитых стран Ближнего Востока? Хотите добить то, что еще не успели ваши санкции? И при этом вы еще умудряетесь устраивать фальшивые рыдания о страданиях простых сирийцев. Простые сирийцы, уставшие от войны и радующиеся возвращению законных властей на освобожденные территории, вас не волнует. Ваши агрессивные действия способствуют усугублению гуманитарной обстановки, о которой на словах вы так печетесь.
Which you are so worried about, according to your statements.
Вы могли бы в 24 часа остановить конфликт в Сирии.
Для
этого Вашингтону, Лондону и Парижу нужно лишь дать команду своим ручным террористам прекратить борьбу против законной власти собственного народа. Удары наносились по сирийским военным аэродромам, которые используются в ходе операций против террористических организаций. Это весьма оригинальный вклад в борьбу с международным терроризмом, как не устает повторять, который, как не устает повторять Вашингтон, является единственной целью его военного присутствия в Сирии. У нас есть в этом большие сомнения. Похоже, окончательно становится ясно, что те на Западе, кто прикрывается гуманитарной риторикой и пытается оправдать свое военное присутствие в Сирии потребностями разгрома джихадистов, в действительности с ними заодно и ведут дело к расчленению страны. Такой расчет подтверждается и категорическим отказом США и их союзников оказывать содействие в восстановлении района Сирии, освобожденных правительственной армией. Наконец, ваша агрессия – это мощный удар и угроза перспективам продолжения политического процесса под эгидой ООН, который, несмотря на объективные трудности, с разной скоростью, но продвигался вперед. Чего тогда стоили ваши бесконечные упования на Женевский процесс, если вы своими руками загоняете его в очередной кризис? Призываем США и их союзников незамедлительно прекратить агрессивные действия в отношении Сирии и не допускать их впредь. Мы предложили вашему вниманию краткий проект резолюции.
We are putting forward for your attention a brief draft resolution which we will demand a vote on at the end of this meeting. We would like to address the members of the Security Council. Today is not the time to shirk your responsibilities. The whole world is looking at you. Take a principled stand. Thank you.
Le agradezco al representante de la Federación de Rusia por su declaración y le doy la palabra a la representante de los Estados Unidos.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your briefing today. This is our 5th Security Council meeting in the past week to address the situation in Syria. A week has gone by in which we have talked. We've talked about the victims in Duma. We've talked about the Assad regime and its patrons, Russia and Iran. We've spent a week talking about the unique horror of chemical weapons. The time for talk ended last night. We're here today because 3 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council acted. The United Kingdom, France, and the United States acted, not as revenge, not as punishment, not as a symbolic show of force. We acted to deter the future use of chemical weapons by holding the Syrian regime responsible for its atrocities against humanity. We can all see that a Russian disinformation campaign is in full force this morning. But Russia's desperate attempts at deflection cannot change the facts. A large body of information indicates that the Syrian regime used chemical weapons in Duma on April 7th. There is clear information demonstrating Assad's culpability. The pictures of dead children were not fake news. They were the result of the Syrian regime's barbaric inhumanity. And they were the result of the regime and Russia's failure to live up to their international commitments to remove all chemical weapons from Syria. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom acted after careful evaluation of these facts. The targets we selected were at the heart of the Syrian regime's illegal chemical weapons program. The strikes were carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties. The responses were justified, legitimate, and proportionate. The United States and its allies did everything we could to use the tools of diplomacy to get rid of Assad's arsenal of chemical weapons. We did not give diplomacy just one chance. We gave diplomacy chance after chance. 6 times. That's how many times Russia vetoed Security Council resolutions to address chemical weapons in Syria. Our efforts go back even further. In 2013, the Security Council passed a resolution that required the Assad regime to destroy its stockpile of chemical weapons. Syria committed to abide by the Chemical Weapons Convention, meaning it could no longer have chemical weapons on its soil. President Putin said Russia would guarantee that Syria complied. We hoped that this diplomacy would succeed in putting an end to the horror of chemical attacks in Syria. But as we see from the past year, that did not happen. While Russia was busy protecting the regime, Assad took notice. The regime knew it could act with impunity, and it did. In November, Russia used its veto to kill the Joint Investigative Mechanism, the main tool we had to figure out who used chemical weapons in Syria. Just as Russia was using its veto, the Assad regime used sarin, leading to dozens of injuries and deaths. Russia's veto was the green light for the Assad regime to use these most barbaric weapons against the Syrian people, in complete violation of international law. The United States and our allies were not going to let that stand. Chemical weapons are a threat to us all. They are a unique threat, a type of weapon so evil that the international community agreed they must be banned. We cannot stand by and let Russia trash every international norm that we stand for and allow the use of chemical weapons to go unanswered. And just as the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons last weekend was not an isolated incident, Our response is part of a new course chartered last year to deter future use of chemical weapons. Our Syrian strategy has not changed. However, the Syrian regime has forced us to take action based on their repeated use of chemical weapons. Since the April 2017 chemical attack at Khan Sheikhoun, the United States has imposed hundreds of sanctions on individuals and entities involved in chemical weapons use in Syria and North Korea. We have designated entities in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that have facilitated chemical weapons proliferation. We have revoked the visas of Russian intelligence officers in response to the chemical attack in Salisbury. We will continue to seek out and call out anyone who uses and anyone who aids in the use of chemical weapons. With yesterday's military action, our message was crystal clear. The United States of America will not allow the Assad regime to continue to use chemical weapons. Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the President this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our President draws a red line, our President enforces the red line. The United States is deeply grateful to the United Kingdom and France for its part in the coalition to defend the prohibition of chemical weapons. We worked in lockstep. We were in complete agreement. Last night, our great friends and indispensable allies shouldered a burden that benefits all of us. The civilized world owes them its thanks. In the weeks and months to come, the Security Council should take time to reflect on its role in defending the international rule of law. The Security Council has failed in its duty to hold those who use chemical weapons to account. That failure is largely due to Russian obstruction. We call on Russia to take a hard look at the company it keeps and live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council and defend the actual principles the United Nations was meant to promote. Last night, we successfully hit the heart of Syria's chemical weapons enterprise. And because of these actions, we are confident we have crippled Syria's chemical weapons program. We are prepared to sustain this pressure if the Syrian regime is foolish enough to test our will. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante de los Estados Unidos por su declaración y le doy la palabra a la representante del Reino Unido.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, these are uncertain times, and today we deal with exceptional circumstance. Acting with our American and French allies, in the early hours of this morning, the United Kingdom conducted coordinated, targeted, and precise strikes to degrade Assad's chemical weapons capability and deter their future use. The British Royal Air Force launched Storm Shadow missiles at a military facility some 15 miles west of Homs, where the regime is assessed to keep chemical weapons in breach of Syria's obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. A full assessment has not yet been completed, but we believe the strikes to be successful. Furthermore, none of the British, US or French aircraft or missiles involved in this operation were successfully engaged by Syrian air defences, and there is also no indication that Russian air defence systems were employed. Our action was a limited, targeted and effective strike. There were clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation, and we did everything possible, including rigorous planning before any action was undertaken, to ensure that we mitigated and minimised the impact on civilians. Together, our action will significantly degrade the Syrian regime's ability to research, develop and deploy chemical weapons and deter their future use. The UK Prime Minister has said, "We are clear about who is responsible for the atrocity of the use of chemical weapons. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for the attack we saw last Saturday. Some of the evidence that leads us to this conclusion is as follows. There are open source accounts alleging that a barrel bomb was used to deliver the chemicals. Multiple open source reports claim a regime helicopter was observed above the city of Duma on the evening of 7th of April. The opposition does not operate helicopters, nor does it use barrel bombs. And reliable intelligence indicates that Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine in Duma on 7th of April. Mr. President, no other group could have carried out this attack. Indeed, Daesh, for example, does not even have a presence in Duma. The Syrian regime has been killing its own people for 7 years. Its use of chemical weapons, which has exacerbated the human suffering, is a serious crime of international concern as a breach of the customary international law prohibition on the use of chemical weapons, and this amounts to a war crime and a crime against humanity. Any state is permitted under international law on an exceptional basis to take measures in order to alleviate overwhelming humanitarian suffering. The legal basis for the use of force for the United Kingdom is humanitarian intervention, which requires 3 conditions to be met. Number 1, that there is convincing evidence, generally accepted by the international community as a whole, of extreme humanitarian distress on a large scale, requiring immediate and urgent relief. I think the debates in this Council and the briefings we have had from OCHA and others have proved that. Secondly, it must be objectively clear that there is no practicable alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. I think the vetoes have shown us that. And thirdly, the proposed use of force must be necessary and proportionate to the aim of relief of humanitarian suffering and must be strictly limited in time and in scope to this aim. And I think we have heard, both in my intervention and in Ambassador Haley's, how that has also been met. The history of the Syrian conflict is a litany of threats to peace and the violations of international law. The Security Council has met 113 times since the Syrian war started. It was therefore not for want of international diplomatic effort that we find ourselves in this position today. After a pattern of chemical weapons use since the outbreak of the conflict, Assad defied the international community in 2013 by launching a sarin gas attack on eastern Ghouta, which left more than 800 people dead. Despite the adoption of Resolution 2118, despite 4 years of patient engagement, Syria continues to use chemical weapons against its people and has failed to answer a long list of serious questions. The only conclusion we can reach is that Syria had not declared or destroyed all of its chemical weapons despite its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is not assertion on our part, but a matter of record. And I draw the Russian ambassador's attention to his points about Barzan and Jumraya. The OPCW still has unanswered questions and discrepancies. He knows this, we all know this. The Council was briefed by the OPCW Director General. Resolution 2118 decides in the event of non-compliance to impose measures under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Yet on 28th of February last year, when the UK, together with France, proposed a resolution taking measures under Chapter 7 short of the use of force, Russia vetoed. The very least this Council should have been able to do, Mr. President, was to follow up on the findings of the Jim report by extending its mandate. Yet 4 times, Russia has vetoed different proposals from different Council members to do just that. The Syrian regime and its supporters are responsible for the gravest violations of international humanitarian law in modern history. They have used indiscriminate weapons, notably barrel bombs and cluster munitions, against civilians, and they have deliberately targeted medical facilities and schools, as well as humanitarian personnel and civilian objects. They have used sieges and starvation as methods of warfare, accompanied by attacks on opposition-held civilian areas. The regime has persistently obstructed humanitarian aid and medical evacuations. Tens of thousands of people have been illegally detained, tortured, and executed by the regime. This is one of the most serious challenges to the international non-proliferation regime we have ever faced. A state party has violated the Chemical Weapons Convention, it has defied the Security Council, and it has broken international law. Repeated attempts over several years to hold them to account have been met with Russian obstruction and resistance. We have repeatedly, in this Council, attempted to overcome this obstruction without success. Mr. President, we are faced with a litany of violations, no sense of guilt, no sense of regret, no sense of responsibility, a shameful record wrapped in a mix of denial, deceit, and disinformation. Mr. President, I would invite those like the Russian ambassador who speak about the Charter to consider the following. It is hard to believe that it is in line with the principles and purposes of the Charter to use or condone the use of chemical weapons. And in the United Kingdom's view, it cannot be illegal to use force to prevent the killing of such numbers of innocent people. I will take no lessons, Mr. President, in international law from Russia. Despite all this, Mr. President, we would like to look forward. The United Kingdom, together with France and the US, will continue to pursue a diplomatic resolution to the Syrian crisis. My French colleague will say more about our work in a few moments. We believe it must comprise 4 elements. 1. Syria's chemical weapons program must be ended and the chemical weapons stockpiles destroyed once and for all. 2. There must be an immediate cessation of hostilities and compliance with all Security Council resolutions, and these include those which mandate humanitarian access. 3. The regime must return to the Geneva talks and agree to engage on the substantial agenda put forward by the UN Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. 4. Finally, there must be accountability for the use of chemical weapons and other war crimes in Syria. Mr. President, the Secretary-General rightly highlighted the political process. We propose that, as the Security Council will all be together next weekend in the retreat with the Secretary-General, very kindly hosted by Sweden, that we should use that opportunity to reflect on next steps and the way back to the political process. And with our allies, we stand ready to work with all members on the Security Council towards this end. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante del Reino Unido por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Francia.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
une semaine après le massacre
a
chimique de
week
la Douma
after the chemical
et au
weapons
lendemain
attack
des
in
frappes de la
Douma
nuit dernière,
and the day after
je veux redire
yesterday's
d'emblée
strikes, let
à
me
ceux qui font mine de s'interroger
say
que la
yet again
France
to
n'a
those who are
strictement
still
aucun
wondering,
doute
France has
sur la
absolutely
responsabilité
no
du régime
doubt
d'Assad
about
dans cette attaque.
the Assad regime's responsibility in this attack.
Nous avons rendu public ce matin
This morning,
une notice
we
d'information
published
collectée par nos services
the
de renseignement.
report of our intelligence services,
Nous y renvoyons ceux qui tentent
and we
une
would
nouvelle
ask
fois
those who yet
de
again
contester les
are
évidences
challenging the
et de
evidence
travestir les
and
faits
distorting the
devant la face du
facts
monde.
in the eyes of the world to review that
Monsieur le
information.
Président, depuis
Mr.
des années,
President, for
Bachar
years,
el-Assad mène avec le
Bashar
soutien
al-Assad,
actif de
with
ses
the
alliés,
active support of
une
his
stratégie de
allies, has carried
destruction
out
destinée
a
à
strategy of
écraser toute
destruction
opposition,
aimed at
au
crushing
mépris
all
des principes les
opposition,
plus élémentaires
flouting
d'humanité
the most basic
et au prix
principles
des
of
vies de centaines de
humanity,
milliers de
and at the
civils
cost of
en
hundreds
Syrie.
of thousands of
Nous
civilian
l'avons
lives
vu
in
à
Syria.
à
We've
Homs,
seen this in
en
Aleppo,
Ghouta
Homs,
orientale.
in eastern Ghouta.
Depuis des années,
For years,
le régime syrien
the
recourt aux
Syrian
armes de
regime
destruction les plus
has
terrifiantes,
used the
les armes
most
chimiques,
terrifying
pour massacrer
weapons of mass
et
destruction,
terroriser sa
chemical
population
weapons, to
civile.
massacre and terrorize its
Nous en
civilian
avons eu une nouvelle
population.
démonstration à
We've seen
Douma,
a further
comme nous
demonstration of this in
l'avions
Douma,
vu
as
auparavant
we had seen
à
in the
Khan
past in
Sheikhoun,
Khan
à Sarmin,
Sheikhoun, in
à
Sarmin,
Talmenes,
in
ou
Talmenes,
encore à
or even
Khmenas,
in Khmenas,
où sa responsabilité a
where
été
Its responsibility was clearly established through the UN and OPCW JIM. No one can say that they did not know. For years, the Syrian regime has systematically and repeatedly violated all of its international obligations. The list of its violations is long. It is overwhelming. We are all familiar with them. Violations of all international obligations on chemical weapons under the CWC, to which Syria has been party since 2013, and of the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which bans the use of these weapons against civilians. The violations of the very underpinnings of international humanitarian law, which are the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. Violations of successive Security Council resolutions 2118, 2209, 2235, and in this way, obligations under the UN Charter. The use of chemical weapons against the civilian population is tantamount to a war crime in accordance with the statutes of the ICC. The Secretary-General of the United Nations in August of 2013 qualified the use of chemical weapons as a crime against humanity. In the face of repeated and confirmed violations by the Damascus regime of all rules underpinning our security, France has constantly called for a strong response from the international community. We have carried out all possible efforts to ensure that these horrors do not go unanswered in the UN and in the OPCW, and that they must be stopped. The Security Council, through its successive resolutions 2118, 2209, 2235, has been committed to imposing coercive measures under UN Charter Chapter 7 in the case of new violations. The Security Council was unable to act in accordance with its commitments due to the systematic negative vote, the veto used by Russia. Systematically using its veto in the Security Council, and in so doing, it has betrayed the commitment it took in 2013 in this Council to guarantee the destruction of the Syrian chemical arsenal. The stalemate in the Security Council in the face of mass atrocities committed in Syria is a deadly and dangerous trap, and we must get out of it. Mr. President, when it ordered the chemical attack on the 7th of April, the Syrian regime knew full well what it was doing. Once again, it wanted to test the threshold of the international community's tolerance, and it found it. In the face of this attack on the principles and the values and the laws underpinning the action of the United Nations, silence is no longer a solution. We can no longer tolerate the trivialization of the use of chemical weapons, which is an immediate danger to the Syrian people and to our collective security. We cannot let the deadly genie of proliferation out of the bottle. We clearly warned the Assad regime and its allies that such a transgression would not go unanswered. We have kept our word, and we have acted in accordance with our responsibility. We have done so in a controlled and transparent fashion, making sure that we avoid any escalation with current actors on the ground. The President of the Republic and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have spoken on this subject. Some who for years have flouted the most basic rules of international law today are affirming that our action runs counter to the UN Charter. And I would remind them that that charter was not designed in order to protect criminals. Our action is in line, fully in line with the goals and values proclaimed even in the first lines of the UN Charter. Our organization's mission is, and I quote, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, end of quote. This action was indeed necessary in order to face the repeated violations by the Syrian regime of its obligations stemming from law, from treaties, and from its own commitments. And finally, our response was designed as a proportionate and precise response with specific targets. The main research center of the CW program and two major production sites were also struck.
c'est la capacité de développer, de mettre au
The
point, de
capacity
produire
to
des
develop,
armes
to
chimiques
perfect and
de la
produce
Syrie,
chemical
qui est
weapons
mise hors
in
d'usage.
Syria has now been
C'était le
put
seul
out of
objectif,
service.
et il est atteint.
That was the only
Monsieur le
objective,
Président,
and that
mon pays,
objective
qui a
has been
connu dans
reached.
sa
Mr.
chair
President,
les effets
my
dévastateurs
country
des armes
knows
chimiques au
firsthand
cours
the
du premier
devastating
conflit mondial,
effects of chemical
ne permettra
weapons
plus
which were
jamais
used in the First
l'impunité de
World War.
l'usage
We
d'armes
can now
chimiques.
no longer allow
Elle ne
for
renoncera
impunity
jamais
for the use of
à
chemical weapons.
identifier les
We will
responsables
never step down. We will
devront en
continue to
répondre devant la
seek to
justice.
identify those responsible
C'est le
and
sens
bring
du
them to
partenariat
justice.
contre
That is
l'impunité
the purpose
que nous
behind
avons
the
lancé en
partnership
janvier
against
dernier.
impunity, which we launched last
Monsieur le
January.
Président,
Mr.
permettez-moi
President,
d'insister
allow
sur
me
ce
to
point.
insist on this
Les
point.
frappes de la nuit dernière
Last
sont une
night's
réponse
strikes are
nécessaire
a
au
necessary
massacre
response
chimique en
given the
Syrie.
chemical
Elles
massacres
sont
in
une
Syria.
réponse
They
au
are
service du
a
droit
response
et
in
de notre
line with
stratégie
law and
politique
our political
pour mettre un
strategy
terme
to
à la
put an
tragédie
end
syrienne.
to the Syrian tragedy.
Nous avons, pour être plus précis,
To
quatre
be more
impératifs
specific,
sur le
we
dossier
have four
syrien.
imperatives on the
Quatre
Syrian
impératifs qui sont
issue,
dans
four
l'intérêt immédiat des
imperatives which are in the immediate
mais aussi
interest
de
of the
l'ensemble de la
Syrians, but
communauté
also in the interest
internationale,
of the entire
comme l'a rappelé
international
le secrétaire
community,
général des Nations
as the
Unies, que
UN
je veux remercier
Secretary
pour
General
son intervention.
reminded us, and I thank him for his briefing.
Permettez-moi de les rappeler.
Allow me to recall them here.
Premièrement, le
Firstly,
démantèlement
the
du programme chimique
dismantling
syrien
of the
de
Syrian
manière
chemical
vérifiable
program
et
in a
irréversible est
verifiable
indispensable.
and irreversible
Nous
way. This
devons ne
is
ménager aucun
essential.
effort
We must
pour
spare
mettre en
no
place un
effort
mécanisme
to set
international
up
d'établissement
an
des
international
responsabilités,
attribution
prévenir
mechanism,
l'impunité
prevent
et
impunity,
empêcher toute velléité de
and
récidive du régime syrien.
stop any repeat attempts by
Deuxièmement,
the Syrian
éradiquer
regime.
le
Secondly, we
terrorisme
must eradicate
en
terrorism
éliminant Daesh
by
durablement.
defeating Daesh
C'est
once
un
and for
engagement de
all.
longue date
This is a
et qui
long-standing
nécessite encore de
commitment,
réels efforts
but it
pour
requires
remporter une victoire
genuine
définitive.
efforts to ensure an ultimate victory.
Troisièmement, un
Thirdly,
cessez-le-feu sur l'ensemble du territoire
ceasefire
syrien
throughout the
et
Syrian
l'accès humanitaire aux
territory
populations
and
civiles,
humanitarian
comme
access to the
l'exige la
civilian
résolution du
populations
Conseil
as
de
required
sécurité.
by Security Council
Il nous faut
resolutions.
un accès
We
humanitaire
must have
entier et sans
full and
entrave
unfettered
pour venir en
humanitarian
aide aux
access in
populations en
order to
détresse,
aid
conformément à la
suffering
résolution
people in
2401.
accordance with Resolution
Il est notamment
2401.
indispensable et
It is
urgent que les
absolutely
convois
essential and
humanitaires
urgent for
atteignent
humanitarian
quotidiennement et
convoys
dans des conditions
to
de sécurité
reach
suffisantes la Ghouta
Eastern
orientale.
Ghouta on a daily basis
Quatrièmement,
in
un plan de
sufficient
sortie de
safety.
crise
Fourthly, we must have
avec
a
une solution
crisis
politique
exit
durable.
strategy with a
Nous ne
lasting
pourrons
political
résoudre
solution.
durablement la crise
We can
syrienne
only
que dans le cadre
resolve
d'une
the
solution
Syrian
politique
crisis once and
inclusive
for all if there
sur
is
la
an
base de la pleine
inclusive
mise en œuvre de la
political
résolution
solution
2254 de
on
ce
the basis
Conseil.
of the full implementation
Nous
of Security
l'appelons de nos
Council
vœux
Resolution
depuis
2254.
année.
We have called
Il
for
n'a
this
jamais
for
été
7
aussi
years.
urgent
It
de la
has
mettre en
never
œuvre
been so
et de
urgent
relancer de
to
véritables
implement that
négociations
resolution
sous
and
l'égide
to
des
launch
Nations Unies
true
en vue
negotiations
d'obtenir
under
une
the
transition
auspices of the
politique
United
en
Nations
Syrie.
in order to achieve
Monsieur le
political
Président, seule
transition in
cette feuille de
Syria.
route nous
Mr.
permettra de
President, only
sortir
this
enfin
roadmap
de
will enable
l'impasse
us once
syrienne.
and for
Et la
all
France
to
est
get
prête à
out of the
y
Syrian
atteler
stalemate.
dès aujourd'hui
France is
avec
prepared,
tous ceux
as
qui
of
seront
today,
prêts
to work
à
with
y
all of
mettre
those
tous
who are
leurs efforts.
prepared to put every effort
Dans cet
into
esprit,
this end.
à
In that
l'initiative de la
spirit
France
and at the
et
initiative
dans la
of
ligne
France
de la déclaration
and
faite
in line with
cette nuit
the
par le président
statement made
Emmanuel Macron,
by President
nous
Emmanuel
présenterons
Macron
dans les meilleurs délais
in
un projet de
the very near
résolution
future
sur
where
ces
we will
différents
be
volets
submitting
avec nos partenaires britanniques et américains.
resolution with our British and American partners.
À cet effet, j'en appelle aujourd'hui au premier
Today,
chef à la Russie pour qu'elle impose
I would
enfin au régime de
ask
Damas
first and foremost
d'entrer dans une
Russia to
logique de
call on
solution
Damascus
négociée
to enter into a negotiated solution so that we can put an end once and for all to the long-lasting suffering of the civilian people in Syria. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Mr. Secretary General for his briefing. Only yesterday, we were gathered here in this chamber for an open meeting on the situation in Syria, during which China made clear its position on the issue of Syria and expressed profound concern over the further escalation of the tensions in Syria and made a clarion call for a political solution to the issue of Syria. Here, I'd like to restate the following. China has consistently stood for peaceful settlement of disputes and against the use of force in international relations. We advocate respect for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of all countries. Any unilateral military actions that circumvent the Security Council contravene the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, violate the basic norms enshrined in international law and those governing international relations, and would handicap the settlement of the Syria issue with new compounding factors. We urge all parties concerned to refrain from any move that may lead to a further escalation of the situation, return to the framework of international law, and solve the issue through dialogue and consultation. China considers it necessary to mount a comprehensive, impartial, and objective investigation of the suspected chemical weapon attack in Syria to arrive at a reliable conclusion that can withstand the test of history. Until that happens, no party must prejudge the outcome. To solve the Syria issue, there is no alternative to political settlement. The parties concerned in the international community should continue to support the role of the United Nations as the main mediator and work together unremittingly towards a political settlement of the issue of Syria. Mr. President, I'd like to restate China stands ready to continue its positive, constructive role in the effort towards a political settlement of the Syria issue in the interest of peace and stability in the Middle East and in the world at large. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de China por su declaración y doy la palabra al representante de Kazajstán.
Mr. President, Kazakhstan expresses its serious concern about the sharp escalation of the situation around Syria. We call on all parties to prevent the further military escalation and take effective steps aimed at restoring confidence, establishing peace and ensuring security in the long-suffering land of Syria on the basis of the UN Charter and the relevant resolutions of the UN Security Council. We called yesterday and the day before yesterday and every time when we observe the increasing tensions in this chamber, to act responsibly in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. Who else, if not the Council members, should show to the world an example of compliance to the principles and provisions of the Charter? We are preaching others to strictly follow the international law and order, but sadly yesterday we witnessed a different example. Whatever action taken under whatever good pretext cannot and will not justify military use of force. Violence against violence would never bring peace and stability. Kazakhstan's position has always been
Kingdom and the United States briefed allies on their joint military action in Syria overnight. They also briefed on the additional non-military measures taken to reinforce the Chemical Weapons Convention. The three allies stressed that a significant body of information indicated that the Syrian regime was responsible for the horrendous attack against civilians in Douma on the 7th of April, which killed a large number of children, women and men. They also made clear that their military action was limited to the Syrian regime's facilities, enabling the production and employment of chemical weapons. They emphasized that there was no practical alternative to the use of force. All NATO allies expressed their full support for the last night's actions, which was intended to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and to deter further chemical weapon attacks against the people of Syria. NATO strongly condemns the repeated use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. Chemical weapons cannot be used with impunity. They cannot become normalized. They are an immediate danger to the Syrian people and to our collective security. And those responsible must be held to account. We call on the Syrian regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, to allow rapid, sustained and unhindered humanitarian access. NATO has consistently condemned Syria's continued use of chemical weapons as a threat to international peace and security. Such outrageous actions call for a collective and effective response by the international community. We support international mechanisms to establish responsibility and prevent impunity on the use of chemical weapons. We regret that the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism to identify perpetrators of chemical attacks was not renewed last year, even though it was established by a resolution of the United Nations Security Council 3 years ago. Despite sustained diplomatic efforts, the Syrian regime's repeated use of chemical weapons against its own people has contributed to appalling human suffering since the start of the conflict. The use of such barbaric weapons is a flagrant violation of international standards and international norms. It is a breach of multiple United Nations resolutions and of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which Syria ratified in 2013. And 100 years after the end of the First World War, we must do all we can to uphold and not to erode the Chemical Weapons Convention. NATO fully supports the efforts led by the United Nations to achieve a lasting political solution to the conflict in Syria. We call on all members of the UN Security Council to uphold their responsibilities. At the same time, we call on all supporters of the Syrian regime, notably Russia, to exercise responsibility to ensure that the Syrian regime participates constructively in the UN-led Geneva process. NATO remains committed to the coalition to defeat ISIS, of which we are part. Defeating terrorism in all its forms remains a key objective for our countries and a key challenge for the stability in the region. And with that, I'm ready to take a few questions.
We'll start with the BBC at the very end.
Thank you. It's Adam Fleming from the BBC. How much of the chemical weapons capability has actually been degraded or destroyed in these strikes? I mean, in other words, could the regime still carry out another Duma even after these airstrikes?
The NATO allies that conducted the strike last night, the United States, the United Kingdom and France, briefed us in detail about the strikes, and they assessed that it was a very successful action, and it has significantly degraded the capabilities of Syria to conduct chemical attacks. And at the same time, it had also sent a very clear message, helping to deter any future use of chemical weapons. But I will leave it to the three allies which actually conducted the airstrikes to comment on details when it comes to the outcome and the effects of the attack. But all NATO allies welcome that three allies conducted attacks which has degraded the capabilities of Syria to conduct the chemical attacks. Let me also underline that this is about making sure that the use of chemical weapons cannot be something that happens with impunity. It has to be reactions, it has to be a strong reaction from the international community, and that's exactly what we saw last night.
Wall Street Journal.
Mr. Secretary General, you've been out here several times in recent weeks talking about the use of chemical weapons in attacks on people, both in the UK and now in Syria. Do you feel that the norms against the use of chemical weapons are weakening? You spoke about the need to strengthen deterrence in this. Do you feel that nations are more willing to use chemical weapons now?
The ban on the use of chemical weapons is under pressure, because we have seen several examples of state actors, Syria, using chemical weapons. And that's also the reason why we have to uphold and support the ban on chemical weapons and not erode it. And that's exactly why NATO allies strongly condemn any use of chemical weapons, and that's also why all NATO allies support the actions taken by 3 allies last night. It is important, especially 100 years after we saw the barbaric effects of chemical weapons used not far away from Brussels, in Flanders fields, where chemical weapons were used during the First World War, to do whatever we can to support, to uphold the ban on chemical weapons. So that's exactly what the actions last night helped to do, and that's exactly also why we will continue to work to strengthen the Chemical Weapons Convention.
NRK in the center.
Secretary General, if the proof is in the pudding, so to say, what is in the pudding? What have you been able to see? What kind of evidence have been shared with you? And why are you convinced, based on this evidence, that this was a correctly timed and correctly carried out attack?
We were briefed by the 3 allies. They have provided a lot of information. We have no reason to doubt the assessments and the findings of our allies, France, the United Kingdom and the United States. We also have to understand that the chemical attack took place in an area where the Assad regime forces are operating, supported by Russia and Iran. We have seen that the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, has used chemical weapons before. We have seen multiple open sources confirming the use of chemical weapons, and also the World Health Organization has confirmed that chemical weapons were used. So all of this creates a picture which is more than enough for us to support the actions conducted by 3 NATO allies last night. There have also been, of course, consultations between NATO and many NATO allies since the attacks on the 7th of April. I was also briefed by Secretary Mattis last night before the attacks. And we have also been, of course, in close contact with both the United Kingdom and France over the last days.
Al Arabiya in the center.
Nuruddin Fridi from Al Arabiya News Channel. Mr. Secretary General, you described the last night military operation as a successful operation. Do you believe, after the briefing that you had with from the 3 states, that the stockpile of chemical weapons has been destroyed and there is no more need for further military attacks against the Syrian regime? And don't you think that this limited operation may complicate the search for a political solution? Thank you.
I didn't get the last question.
Don't you think that this military operation, even if it is a limited one, may threaten the search for a political solution by the United Nations?
No, actually on the contrary. I think if we have just been silent and accepted the use of chemical weapons, it will have undermined the efforts to find a political solution. So we strongly express support for a UN-led political process. There is no military solution to the conflict in Syria, but at the same time, I think it really will be dangerous if the international community accepts use of chemical weapons, and therefore we support the actions taken last night, which were very targeted, measured and proportionate, and actually targeted at chemical weapon facilities. We have been briefed by the allies that conducted these strikes that they assess them as very effective. They have been able to degrade the capabilities of the the Syrian regime, and we are of course glad and we welcome the detailed briefs we have received from our allies on the effect of the attacks.
Thank you very much, Etartas, Denis Dubrovin. Mr. Secretary General, has United States explained why they decided to strike today on Saturday when the group of the international inspectors from the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons have just arrived in Syria to verify all the details of the presumed chemical attack? And second question, whom do you intend to bomb in case the information about this chemical attack would be proven to be wrong? Thank
you. We welcome the fact that the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, is on the ground in Syria. We have been calling for that for a long time. But it is important to understand the difference between OPCW and an independent investigation, because the OPCW doesn't have a mandate to attribute, to say who's behind the attack. They can provide analysis, assessments about whether a chemical attack has taken place, but they cannot attribute who is behind. That's exactly, and who is responsible. That's exactly why NATO allies in the Security Council and all NATO allies have supported repeated calls and repeated initiatives to have an independent investigation into the chemical attacks in Syria. And these initiatives have been blocked again and again by Russia by using the veto in the Security Council. So actually before the attack took place, before the strikes took place last night, the NATO allies exhausted all other possible ways to address this issue through the UN Security Council by diplomatic and political means. But since this was blocked by Russia, there was no other alternative than to react the way they reacted this night.
Politico, last question.
With Politico. Two quick questions. This is not the first time we're here. A little more than a year ago, President Trump ordered strikes because of a chemical attack. Understanding your point that there needs to be an answer from the international community, what gives you any reason to believe that this restrained, limited strike won't have us back here again in 6 months or a year when there's another reason that the Assad regime may see for using chemical weapons? And also, I can't help but notice that you have Russia on the mind. To what extent do you hold Moscow responsible for the attacks that took place, the use of chemical weapons, which they had obviously committed to removing in Astana? So
Russia provides support to the Assad regime, and they have done that again and again, and they continue to do so. And in the area where a chemical weapon attack happened or took place on the 7th of April is an area where Assad regime operates with support of Russia. The attacks last night degraded the capabilities of Syria to conduct new attacks. And at the same time, it sends a clear message which deter further attacks. But of course, we will never have a total guarantee against new attacks as long as we have regimes or state and non-state actors which are willing to use chemical weapons. That's exactly the reason why we need to continue to work hard to protect and uphold the ban on chemical weapons. War and weapons is barbaric, but chemical weapons are in particular barbaric, and that's the reason why we have a specific ban on chemical weapons. If the international community just accepted the use of chemical weapons without doing anything, it would be obvious that we would have risked escalation and more use of chemical weapons. So I'm not saying that the attacks last night solved all problems, but compared to the alternative to do nothing, this was the right thing to do. It deters further attacks. It degrades the capabilities of the Syrian regime to conduct new attacks, and it's a way to support the ban on chemical weapons.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press point. Thank you.
Thank you.
moment that we will waver in our pursuit of full accountability for the perpetrators of past chemical attacks. We will not settle for anything less than an independent, impartial attribution mechanism so that the culprits of those heinous attacks can be identified and held accountable. And we call on the Russian Federation to stop opposing this. The use of chemical weapons is a serious violation of international law and may constitute a war crime or crime against humanity. The Kingdom of the Netherlands strongly believes that the international community must fully uphold the standard that the use of chemical weapons is never permissible. Impunity cannot and will not prevail. But should this Council continue to suffer from the paralysis inflicted by a single permanent member, we must not forget that the UN is bigger than this Council alone. We have strong leadership at the top of the United Nations organization, and we have a powerful General Assembly. Both have to consider all instruments to advance accountability for the use of chemical weapons. The Kingdom of the Netherlands welcomes every option to establish an independent and impartial mechanism, be it within the UN framework or within the framework of other relevant international organizations, as long as it results in a mechanism that can establish who's responsible so that subsequently the perpetrators can be held to account. Any new mechanism should build upon the important work of the JIM and the ongoing OPCW fact-finding mission. It is therefore crucial that the fact-finding mission has complete and unhindered access to all information, all sides it deems necessary to conduct its investigations with regard to the attack with chemical weapons in Duma last weekend. Mr. President, the international norms against the use of chemical weapons must be respected, and the Syrian people must be relieved from the violence, hardship, and injustice that has haunted them for so long. To that end, we call for a political solution and immediate cessation of violence as earlier agreed upon by this Council, as well as full, unhindered and immediate humanitarian access. We reiterate our determination to achieve justice for the victims. We need to collectively stand up for the fate of the Syrian people. The need to collectively stand up for the fate of the Syrian people is now more apparent than ever. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco a la representante de Países Bajos por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante del Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi delegación desea agradecer al secretario general por su presencia y por su participación en esta sesión. Bolivia agradece a la Federación de Rusia por haber tomado la iniciativa de convocar esta reunión de emergencia del Consejo de Seguridad. Hoy es un día oscuro en la historia de este Consejo. 3 miembros permanentes han tomado la decisión de, violando la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, tomar acciones unilaterales en contra de la soberanía e integridad territorial de otro Estado miembro de nuestra organización. Bolivia desea manifestar de manera clara y categórica su condena al uso de armas químicas o el uso de elementos químicos como armas por ser un hecho injustificable y criminal donde quiera, cuando y por quien quiera sea cometido, puesto que su uso es un delito grave contra el derecho internacional, la paz y seguridad internacional. Los responsables de la comisión de estos terribles y criminales actos deben ser identificados, investigados, procesados y sancionados con el mayor rigor. Bolivia continúa exigiendo una investigación transparente e imparcial para que se determine quiénes son los responsables. Pero además de ese tema, el motivo de esta reunión es el hecho de que, reitero, 3 miembros permanentes de ese Consejo han hecho uso de la fuerza en violación de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. No se puede combatir la supuesta violación del derecho internacional con la violación del derecho internacional. Bolivia está sorprendida por el hecho de que los miembros permanentes, al tener una mayor responsabilidad
given that they
para
have a greater
mantener la paz y la
responsibility
seguridad
for maintaining
internacionales,
international peace and
dejen
security,
de lado a las Naciones Unidas
have decided
cuando les
to
conviene.
bypass or
Exprimen al
bypass the United
multilateralismo
Nations
hasta que no les
when
sirve
it
y
suits
luego
them.
lo desechan.
They defend multilateralism
Cuando
as
ya no
long as
cumple
it
con
serves
sus
them, and then
intereses,
they simply discard it.
entonces ya no les interesa
When
el
it is no
multilateralismo.
longer in their interest, they're no longer attached to multilateralism.
Y este no es el único caso en el que
This is not the only
lamentablemente se han
case
utilizado
where,
acciones
unfortunately,
unilaterales.
unilateral action has been used.
Recordemos y no nos
Let's
cansaremos de
recall,
recordar
and we will never
los sucesos
tire of
en Irak
recalling
el
the
año
events in Iraq
2003
in
y en
2003
Libia el año
and in Libya
2011.
in 2011.
Toda acción debe ser autorizada por el
Any,
Consejo de Seguridad de
such
acuerdo
action
con la
should be
Carta de las
authorized
Naciones
by the
Unidas.
Security Council
Toda
in
acción
accordance with the United
unilateral
Nations
es
Charter.
contraria
Any
al derecho
unilateral
internacional,
action
así como a los
counter to
valores y
international
principios de
law
la
and
Carta de
counter
las
to
Naciones
the
Unidas.
values and principles of the
Bolivia
United
rechaza
Nations
el uso o la amenaza
Charter
del uso de
is
la fuerza.
unacceptable. Bolivia rejects the use of force.
Las acciones unilaterales
Unilateral action
responden no solamente a intereses
not only
específicos de quienes las ejercen,
respond to the specific interests of those who
sino que son
carry them
medidas,
out,
y
but in
permítame
fact,
la expresión,
they're measures that,
imperialistas.
and allow me the expression, are imperialist measures.
Sucede que los imperios, como decíamos en otra intervención,
It so
se
happens
creen
that
moralmente
empires, as
superiores
we
al resto
stated
del mundo.
earlier, consider themselves superior to the
Se
rest of
creen
the world.
excepcionales y se
They
creen
think that they're exceptional.
indispensables.
They think that they're
Y por tanto se
indispensable.
creen por encima de la
And
ley,
hence,
se creen
they think
por
they're
encima
above the
del
law,
derecho internacional.
above international law.
Pero en realidad el
But in
interés
fact,
de quienes utilizan unilateralmente
interests
la
of
fuerza
those
y violan la Carta de las
who
Naciones Unidas
unilaterally use force and
no
violate
es el de
United
avanzar la
Nations Charter.
democracia,
It's
no
not
es el
really
de
to
avanzar la
advance
libertad,
democracy
no
or
es el de
advance
luchar
freedom
contra
or
el
to
uso de armas químicas. Su
combat
objetivo es
the
expandir
use
su
of
poder
chemical
y
weapons. Their
expandir su
goal is expand their
dominación.
power and expand their domination.
Lo que hemos presenciado en las
What
últimas
we have
horas
witnessed over the past few hours
es un ataque contra la misión de la búsqueda de los
is
hechos
an
desplegada por la
attack
OPAC,
against the
la cual no inició los
fact-finding
trabajos
mission
que
of the
tenían programados
OPCW,
para
which
hoy.
hasn't even started work that was scheduled to begin today.
El ataque unilateral
The unilateral
es un ataque
attack
contra las organizaciones
is an attack
multilaterales,
against
como la
multilateral
Organización para la
organizations,
Proscripción de Armas
such
Químicas,
as
la OPAC.
the OPCW.
Es un ataque contra
It's
este
attack
Consejo
against this
y
council
contra su tarea principal
and
del
its
mantenimiento de
main
la paz y seguridad
duty of
internacionales.
maintaining international peace and security.
Es un ataque
It is an
contra
attack
la Carta de las Naciones
against the
Unidas
United
y es un
Nations
ataque
Charter.
contra toda la
And it
comunidad
is an attack
internacional.
against the entire international community.
Me pregunto
I'm wondering
a esos miembros permanentes que han utilizado la fuerza
whether
hace
the
pocas horas,
permanent members
¿cuánto
who
dinero han
used force,
invertido en
just a few
armar
hours ago,
y entrenar
how much money they
a los grupos
invested in
armados
arming and
en
training
Siria?
the armed groups in Syria?
¿Detrás de qué recursos naturales están?
They are behind which
¿Con qué autoridad
national
moral
resources?
podrán hablar de
And
la
with what
Carta de
kind
las
of
Naciones Unidas en
moral
otros casos?
authority can they invoke the United Nations Charter in other situations?
Es larga la historia,
The history,
lamentablemente, de las
unfortunately,
violaciones a los
of
principios y propósitos de
violations
la
of
Carta.
principles and purposes
Habíamos
of the
hablado de
Charter is
Libia,
long.
hablamos de
We
Irak,
mentioned Libya,
pero existen
mentioned
capítulos
Iraq,
recientes.
but there are more recent chapters.
Lo sucedido con la decisión unilateral
What happened with the unilateral
sobre Jerusalén
decision
es otra
regarding
señal
Jerusalem
absolutamente clara
is another
de la falta de
clear
respeto al
signal
derecho internacional.
of a lack of respect for international law.
¿Quiénes son los que venden armas
Who are those who
a
sell
quienes
weapons
bombardean a civiles en Yemen?
to those who bomb civilians in
¿Quiénes han
Yemen?
rechazado el
Who are
Acuerdo de
those who
París sobre el cambio
rejected the
climático?
Paris Agreement,
¿Quiénes han alejado
the
de
climate
las
agreement?
negociaciones
Who are
sobre el Pacto
those
Global de
who
Migraciones?
stepped
¿Quiénes son los
away
que
from other
construyen
international
muros?
agreements? Who are those who build walls?
Pero creemos que es importante
But
también
we also believe
hablar sobre la
that
historia
it's
larga.
important to look at history
Estamos viviendo
over the-
las consecuencias,
the
sobre
long
todo en
run,
el Medio
over
Oriente,
longer
de los
periods of
estragos
time.
provocados por
We
algunas de las mismas
are,
potencias hace más de un siglo
experiencing the consequences in the Middle East
su
of
desprecio
the
por el derecho
actions
internacional.
provoked by certain colonialist powers dating back to a century or
Lo
more.
mismo que se vive en el marco del desprecio al derecho internacional
And, the
ahora
same
en
thing
Siria,
that we're experiencing in Syria,
se lo vive
complete
en
disdain
cierta
for
medida
international law, is
cuando,
also
por ejemplo, el Reino Unido
something that we are seeing when
no retorna la
example,
soberanía de las Islas Malvinas
the United Kingdom
a la Argentina.
refuses to return
o cuando se mantiene irresuelto el problema del archipiélago de Chagos.
or when the
Ojalá que
Chavos
se
Archipelago
respete
issue is not
la opinión
resolved.
consultiva de la Corte Internacional de
And
Justicia sobre
when the
ese tema.
advisory opinion of the International
Es
Court of
decir,
Justice
estamos
on this
hablando
topic
sobre
is
un
not
conjunto
heated.
de
In other words,
políticas
we are talking about a
atentatorias a la
whole
paz y a la
range
seguridad
of policies
internacional.
that undermine international peace and security.
La distinguida representante permanente de los Estados Unidos dice que los Estados Unidos, su país, están listos para disparar. Locked and loaded. Y, por supuesto, escuchamos claramente sus palabras con mucha preocupación y con mucha tristeza. Sabemos que ellos tienen portaaviones, sabemos que ellos tienen satélites, sabemos que ellos tienen, entre comillas, misiles inteligentes, sabemos que tienen un arsenal de armas nucleares. Y también sabemos que tienen un desdén por el derecho internacional. Pero nosotros tenemos esto. Tenemos los principios y los propósitos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Y al final, como la historia nos lo demuestra una y otra vez, al final, estos principios van a prevalecer. Muchas gracias.
Agradezco al representante de Bolivia por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Kuwait.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. في البداية نتقدم بالشكر للأمين العام
Thank you,
سيد
Mr.
أنطونيو
President.
غوتيريس
Allow me
على
to begin
إحاطته
by
في
thanking
بداية
the
أعمال
Secretary
هذه
General, Mr.
الجلسة.
Antonio Guterres, for his briefing at the
تؤمن
beginning of
دولة
this meeting.
الكويت وتلتزم
Kuwait
بميثاق
is
ومبادئ
convinced
الأمم المتحدة
and is committed to the principles and objectives of the United Nations and respect for sovereignty of states and non-interference in the internal affairs and the peaceful
وقد
settlement
حدد من
of
الميثاق في
disputes.
المادة 24
The
مسؤولية
Charter
مجلس الأمن
in Article
عن صيانة
24
السلم
has
والأمن
determined the
الدوليين
responsibility
وأنه
of the
يتصرف
Security
نيابة عن
Council in the
الدول
maintenance
الأعضاء
of international
لتحقيق
peace and
أو لتنفيذ
security,
هذه
and it
الولاية.
can act on behalf of member states
وفي
in order to
المادة
carry out that
25
mandate.
نصت
In
على
Article
التزام الدول الأعضاء
25
بتنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن.
stipulates that the
ولكن ما
members
شاهدناه في ملف
agree to
الأزمة
accept
السورية هو
and carry out the
تعطيل
decisions
لإرادة
of the
المجتمع
Security Council.
الدولي
What we have
وانتهاك
seen in the
صارخ
Syrian
لقراراته.
crisis is a stalemate of the international community's efforts and a
لقد
flagrant
تابعنا
violation
باهتمام وقلق
of
بالغين
our resolutions.
التطورات
We have
الخطيرة في
followed
سوريا
quite closely
والمتمثلة في
and with
العمليات
great
العسكرية
concern the
الأخيرة
most recent developments
ردا
in
على
Syria
استخدام السلطات السورية
as a result of the most
للأسلحة
recent military
الكيميائية
operations
المحرمة
in
الدولية.
response to the use of chemical weapons by
ونؤكد
Syrian
بأن هذه التطورات أتت
authorities
نتيجة
in accordance with
لتعطيل جهود
international law.
المجتمع الدولي ممثلا في مجلس الأمن
And we see that
للوصول
this
إلى
is
حل سياسي
as a
للصراع
result of
الدامي
the
في
stalemate
سوريا
in the
الذي
Security
امتد
Council
لأكثر
and
من
our
7
inability
سنوات
to arrive at a political
وراح
settlement
ضحيته مئات
to this
الآلاف وتشريد
bloody
الملايين من أبناء الشعب
conflict
السوري
in Syria that has lasted for
وتسبب
more than
بدمار
7
كبير
years and
للبنية
has led
التحتية في
to
مدن
massive
عديدة.
displacement and the death of hundreds of thousands of people and major
سيد الرئيس
destruction of
لقد حظى
infrastructure in many
الملف
towns.
الكيماوي
Mr.
ولفترة
President,
طويلة
the
بموقف
chemical
موحد
weapons
داخل
file
المجلس
for
وقد كان موقفا
some
حازما
time has
في إدانة أي استخدام للأسلحة
represented,
الكيميائية في
has
سوريا
had a unified approach within this council.
ومن
We
قبل
have
أي طرف
condemned the
كان.
use of any chemical weapons in
بل
Syria,
أكثر من
regardless
ذلك
of
اتخذ
the
مجلس
party which
الأمن
has used
القرار
such weapons.
2018
Moreover, the Security Council
بالإجماع
adopted resolution
وهو الذي قرر
2118
فرض تدابير
unanimously,
بموجب الفصل
a
السابع
resolution which
بميثاق
imposed
الأمم المتحدة.
measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
في حال عدم امتثال الأطراف لأحكامه وفي حال
In the case
استمرار
of
استخدام
non-conformity
الأسلحة
by the various
الكيميائية في
parties
سوريا
with the
وهي الأسلحة
provisions,
المحرمة دوليا
and
كما ذكرنا.
if chemical weapons were to be used in
ولضمان
Syria,
تفعيل ذلك
these
القرار
are
نجح
internationally banned
المجلس في
weapons, as
شهر
we have
أغسطس من
said.
عام
In order to guarantee the
2015
implementation of that
باستصدار
resolution, the
القرار
Security Council in August of 2015 was able to
2035
adopt
الذي أنشأ
Resolution
آلية التحقيق المشتركة
2235 establishing the joint investigatory mechanism
بهدف
JIM,
تحديد المسؤولين عن
in
أي
order
جرائم
to
باستخدام
determine
الأسلحة الكيميائية في
responsibility
سوريا
of any crime in the use of chemical
وبالفعل
weapons in
حددت الآلية
Syria.
مرتكبي
And
تلك
in point of
الجرائم
fact,
في حوادث
that
عدة
mechanism did identify the authors of
إلا
that
أن
crime
الانقسام
on a
المؤسف
number
في
of
موقف
occasions.
المجلس شجع أطراف الأزمة على الاستمرار في مخالفة قرارات الشرعية الدولية وانتهاك القانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي بحقوق الإنسان وقرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة. ويأتي القرار الأخير 2401 مثالا آخر على انتهاك القرارات حيث اعتمده المجلس بالإجماع رغم أنه دعا إلى وقف إطلاق النار دون تأخير والسماح بدخول المساعدات الإنسانية للمناطق المحاصرة، ولكن هذا القرار الإنساني كما تعلمون لم يجد مع الأسف طريقه للتنفيذ. إن دولة الكويت تأسف لهذا التصعيد وتدعو إلى تجاوز الخلافات ما بين أعضاء المجلس وتدعو إلى استعادة وحدة مجلس الأمن وضرورة تحمله لمسؤولياته في صيانة السلم والأمن الدولي وفقا لما نص عليه ميثاق الأمم المتحدة وسد الفجوة الموجودة حاليا من خلال الاتفاق على آلية جديدة مستقلة ومحايدة ومهنية في أي استخدام للأسلحة الكيماوية في سوريا تهدف إلى تحديد الأطراف المسؤولة عن أي تلك الجرائم ونجدد استعدادنا التام للمشاركة في أي جهود تصب في اتجاه تحقيق التوافق في مواقف الدول الأعضاء في المجلس وبما يضمن محاسبة مرتكبي هذه الجرائم وضمان عدم إفلاتهم من العقاب وبما يحافظ على منظومة عدم انتشار أسلحة الدمار الشامل. سيد الرئيس، من المؤكد بأنه لا حل عسكري للأزمة في سوريا ولا بد من تكثيف الجهود لتجنيب الشعب السوري مزيد من المعاناة. ونجدد هنا موقفنا المبدئي والثابت من الأزمة السورية والذي يتفق وينسجم مع موقف جامعة الدول العربية الداعي للحفاظ على وحدة وسيادة واستقلال سوريا ووقف أعمال العنف والقتال لحقن الدماء والحفاظ على أرواح أبناء الشعب السوري والتوصل إلى تسوية سلمية تحت رعاية الأمم المتحدة بناء على بيان جنيف الأول لعام 2012 والقرار 2254 وبما يحقق انتقالا سياسيا توافق عليه جميع مكونات الشعب السوري ويحقق طموحاته المشروعة.
Le agradezco al representante de Kuwait por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Etiopía.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Peruvian presidency for responding quickly to the request for the holding of this meeting. And we want to express appreciation to Russia for putting the request. It would have been a serious dereliction of duty on the part of the Council if it had failed to meet in light of what had transpired yesterday. We also thank the Secretary General for his briefing and for being here. For those of us elected members of the Security Council, the responsibility is indeed extremely heavy to the point of being unbearable. We are here, let's not forget, representing 193 countries to whom we have made, unlike the permanent members, so many promises, but which in general are encapsulated in the Charter of the United Nations. For those of us members of the African Union, an organization which for obvious historical reasons attaches huge importance to scrupulous adherence to the principles of the Charter, the obligation we have to tell the truth and stand up and be counted for peace is just enormously heavy. All the more so when the parties involved, from our own national perspective, are friends, Mr. President. It was only yesterday that the UN Secretary General urged member states to act responsibly in these dangerous circumstances and stressed the need to avoid the Syrian situation from spiraling out of control. And indeed, he repeated the same today. We also have been repeatedly expressing our concern that the dynamic in Syria could lead to devastating consequences not only nationally, but regionally and internationally. No doubt, the strike undertook by the three countries yesterday appears for the moment not to have led to the spiraling of the situation out of control. We do not take that lightly, even though it might be difficult to take it in light of the potential danger we still face as a consolation. That is why we call for maximum restraint, the exercise of wisdom, as well as a quick return to dialogue among the major powers that have enormous influence on the current situation in Syria. As we have stressed yesterday and earlier, it's absolutely vital to resume the path of diplomacy. The alternative, no doubt, would be catastrophic, beyond our imagination. We hope nobody wants to see that happening, but it could if we do not act together with a huge sense of urgency to diffuse the current tension and reduce further military escalation. Mr. President, by no means do we overlook the genesis of this tragedy we are facing. It has to do with the alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma. At least that's what ratcheted up the tension, leading to what took place yesterday, which is difficult to defend as being consistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. But there is also one point which makes it difficult for us to understand what took place yesterday. The fact-finding mission of the OPCW is arriving, or, as just said by the Secretary General, has already arrived in Syria to investigate the alleged use of chemical weapons, which is the cause of all this tension. In light of that, we have to be excused if we were a little perplexed, Mr. President. While the priority of the time is clearly averting the further escalation of the latest development, we are not underestimating, even now, the importance of ensuring accountability for any confirmed use of chemical weapons in Syria. In this regard, the OPCW fact-finding mission should be allowed to conduct a thorough investigation to establish the facts related to alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma. The sustainable way to end impunity, which we believe is extremely important, is to deter, stop use of chemicals as weapons, is through a united and concerted action, including through setting up an attribution mechanism that this Council could and must take. This has become all the more critical now when, as we all know, truth is becoming very difficult to establish. The opportunity has been created for parties and even individuals to claim the veracity of their own facts. We know we are all disappointed by the current deadlock, but that should not justify overlooking the obligation to adhere to the principles of the Charter. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by referring to what the Secretary General has said yesterday. I wanted to refer to it again because it reflects the truth and therefore is worth repeating. The Cold War has returned with vengeance, he said, but this time it's not being managed. That's why we have to appeal to the members of the Security Council, especially the Permanent Five, to help create a situation where diplomacy would have the upper hand and the primacy of politics would be our guide for coming out of what is a troubled moment in our recent history. The Geneva process and Special Envoy de Mistura needs the unqualified support of the Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de Etiopía por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Guinea Ecuatorial.
Gracias, señor presidente. Señor secretario general Antonio Guterres, muchas gracias
por vuestra declaración, la declaración que acaba de darnos y que nos ilustra claramente sobre el punto de vista de las Naciones Unidas sobre esta cuestión. Indudablemente, lo acaecido anoche no ha constituido sorpresa alguna para ninguno de este Consejo de Seguridad. Solo quedaba saber el día y la hora. En efecto, como lo indicamos ayer en nuestra intervención, nos preocupaba la retórica que estábamos escuchando y expresamos nuestra preocupación hacia dónde nos iba a llevar. Pues nos ha llevado a donde temíamos y a donde no deseábamos, a los ataques militares contra Siria. Ayer en esta tribuna, el señor secretario general de nuestra organización, Antonio Guterres, hablaba de la memoria de la Guerra Fría. En efecto, la Guerra Fría ha vuelto con fuerza en la última madrugada, recordando a los pueblos del mundo la confrontación de intereses existentes entre dos bloques. La República de Guinea Ecuatorial ha seguido con suma preocupación los informes sobre los ataques realizados por Estados Unidos con apoyo de las Fuerzas Armadas de Francia y Reino Unido. Según estimaciones, la coalición disparó más de 100 misiles de crucero y misiles aire-tierra desde los dos buques de armada estadounidenses emplazados en el Mar Rojo, así como desde aviones tácticos de combate que sobrevolaban el mar Mediterráneo y los bombarderos B-1B desde la zona de Al-Tanaf. De forma coordinada, la coalición atacó 3 objetivos que incluyen un centro de investigación científica en una zona de Damasco, una instalación situada al oeste de la ciudad de Homs y un puesto de mando localizado cerca de esta instalación. Señor presidente, estos ataques de anoche, aunque quirúrgicos y muy selectivos, han sido contra el capítulo 5 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y de los principios y normas del derecho internacional. Es preciso recordar que, según el artículo 24 de la Carta, el Consejo tiene la responsabilidad primordial de preservar la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Los miembros del Consejo deben abstenerse, por tanto, de generar situaciones de inseguridad y desequilibrio. Señor presidente, el Consejo de Seguridad no debe destacar y descuidar que estos ataques puedan conllevar consecuencias imprevisibles y potencialmente dramáticos para Oriente Medio, incitando o justificando el desarrollo de programas nucleares con el objetivo de prevenir cualquier agresión futura. Los especialistas de la OPAC se encuentran ya en Duma para proceder a las investigaciones. Hasta que no dispongamos de pruebas fidedignas y contundentes del supuesto ataque químico llevado a cabo la semana pasada en Duma, la República de Guinea Ecuatorial es de la opinión de que cualquier agresión no deba ser justificada. Asimismo, nuestra delegación reitera que, según lo estipulado en el artículo 33 de la Carta, que para toda controversia susceptible de poner en peligro el mandamiento y el mantenimiento, mejor dicho, de la paz y la seguridad internacionales, es un imperativo tratar de buscarle solución, ante todo mediante la negociación, la mediación u otros medios pacíficos. Señor presidente, la historia sigue enseñándonos que las intervenciones militares nunca han solucionado los conflictos, sino más bien los multiplican y los eternizan, creando la desolación y la ruina. Debemos procurar que ello no vuelva a ocurrir en el caso de la República de Siria. Y volvemos a señalarlo. La intervención militar en Libia en 2011 y sus consecuencias hoy en día deben constituir una clara lección a la comunidad internacional. La República de Guinea Ecuatorial es contraria al uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales y solo admitimos su uso cuando está de conformidad con los principios del derecho internacional y de las disposiciones de la Carta de la ONU. Y en el caso de la situación en Siria ya dijimos que no aportaría ningún cambio sustancial a la situación global en el país. Reiteramos que el acuerdo político es la única forma viable para encontrar una solución definitiva al problema sirio. Todas las partes involucradas deben resolver sus diferencias mediante diálogo, concertación y consultas, y ese proceso necesita del apoyo de la comunidad internacional. El fracaso de la diplomacia únicamente agrava el sufrimiento del pueblo sirio y es la máxima expresión del fracaso de este Consejo de Seguridad. Guinea Ecuatorial sigue pensando que para esclarecer totalmente lo ocurrido en Duma el pasado 7 de abril, se debe llevar a cabo una investigación exhaustiva, imparcial y objetiva para llegar a una conclusión confiable. Instamos a la misión de determinación de los hechos de la Organización para la Prohibición de las Armas Químicas a realizar rápidamente una investigación e informar sobre sus conclusiones lo antes posible ante el Consejo de Seguridad, al igual que volvemos a insistir sobre la urgente necesidad de crear, bajo los auspicios del señor secretario general, un órgano de investigación profesional independiente y transparente que pueda atribuir la responsabilidad y la autoría de la utilización de armas químicas, a fin de que dichos autores, sea quien sea o quienes sean sometidos a la justicia internacional. Solo de esta forma, esta espinosa cuestión podría encontrar consenso y la voz unánime de este Consejo de Seguridad. Señor Presidente, finalizo mi intervención repitiendo la postura sin equívocos de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, que es la de condena sin reservas de la utilización de armas químicas, sea quien sea el que las utilice. Muchas gracias.
Le agradezco al representante de Guinea Ecuatorial por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, la délégation ivoirienne remercie Monsieur le Secrétaire général pour sa présence et pour son exposé sur les derniers développements de la situation en Syrie suite aux frappes aériennes menées par certains membres du Conseil de sécurité dans la nuit du 25 vendredi 13 avril 2018. La Côte d'Ivoire demande à l'ensemble des acteurs impliqués à divers niveaux dans le conflit en Syrie de faire preuve de retenue et de ne pas compliquer davantage la situation désastreuse dans laquelle se trouve le peuple syrien. Les armes et les bombes ont trop frappé la Syrie, au mépris des fondements de notre action collective en faveur de la paix. Monsieur le Président, est-il besoin de rappeler que, en signant la Charte des Nations Unies en 1945, les membres fondateurs de l'ONU avaient à cœur de parvenir à instaurer un nouvel ordre mondial fondé sur le multilatéralisme et sa volonté de faire de la paix un bien commun universel dont la préservation a été confiée aux Nations Unies et au Conseil de sécurité dans le cadre de ses responsabilités fondamentales. Le secrétaire général vient de nous le rappeler. Dans toutes les circonstances où elle a guidé l'action de la communauté internationale, le respect des principes de la Charte des Nations Unies nous a toujours permis de surmonter les difficultés les plus inextricables, évitant ainsi bien des désastres à l'humanité. C'est donc fort de sa conviction profonde dans les vertus du multilatéralisme que mon pays estime que le recours à la force dans le but de préserver la paix et la sécurité internationale doit être autorisé par le Conseil de sécurité afin de lui préserver l'autorité juridique indispensable et éviter ainsi toutes les dérives et tous les abus. Seul le Conseil de sécurité, fort de sa forte et représentative, de notre temps saura mobiliser les Nations Unies et pourra mobiliser tous les membres des Nations Unies autour de sa responsabilité première du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. La Côte d'Ivoire exprime donc ses vives préoccupations au regard de l'incapacité de notre Conseil à relancer le dialogue en Syrie et à faire reculer les partisans de la solution militaire. Monsieur le Président, la Côte d'Ivoire saisit l'opportunité de la présente séance pour réitérer sa condamnation sans réserve à l'utilisation des armes chimiques, quels qu'en soient les auteurs, et appelle à la mise en place d'un mécanisme multilatéral d'établissement des responsabilités et à traduire les auteurs d'utilisation d'armes chimiques devant les juridictions internationales compétentes. Dans ce contexte, elle réitère son soutien à l'enquête qui sera menée par la mission d'établissement des faits de l'Organisation pour l'interdiction des armes chimiques en vue de faire la lumière sur les allégations d'utilisation d'armes chimiques à Douma, dans le Ghouta oriental. La Côte d'Ivoire exhorte à nouveau les membres du Conseil de sécurité à une unité d'action afin de mettre un terme à leurs divergences et de parvenir à la mise en place de ce mécanisme de réduction des comptes que tous les membres du Conseil appellent de leur vœu. Monsieur le Président, la Côte d'Ivoire réaffirme sa conviction et sa position de principe selon laquelle la réponse à la crise en Syrie ne saurait être militaire. Au contraire, elle doit plutôt être recherchée dans le cadre d'un dialogue et d'un processus politique inclusif, comme le prévoit la feuille de route de la résolution 2254 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. L'heure est donc venue de donner résolument une chance au dialogue et de remettre notre Conseil dans le sens de l'histoire. Je vous remercie.
Le agradezco al representante de Côte d'Ivoire por su declaración. Formularé ahora una declaración en mi calidad de representante del Perú. El Perú observa con profunda preocupación la evolución de los sucesos en Siria. Ante las acciones militares en respuesta a las informaciones sobre el uso de armas químicas en contra de la población civil en ese país, reiteramos la necesidad de evitar que la situación se salga de control y genere mayores amenazas para la estabilidad en la región y para la paz y seguridad internacional. El Perú condena todo empleo de armas químicas que constituye un crimen atroz y por ello ha apoyado el urgente envío a Siria de una misión de investigación de la Organización para la Prohibición de las Armas Químicas, OPAC, así como la creación de un mecanismo de atribución de responsabilidades dedicado, independiente, objetivo e imparcial, y lamenta el bloqueo para que el Consejo tome una decisión al respecto. En ese sentido, el Perú alienta al secretario general de las Naciones Unidas a redoblar sus esfuerzos de conformidad con las prerrogativas que le confiere la Carta, con miras a apoyar a resolver el impasse en que se encuentra el Consejo y establecer el referido mecanismo de atribución de responsabilidades. El Perú considera que toda respuesta a los crímenes cometidos en Siria, así como la solución al conflicto en Siria, deben ajustarse a la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, el derecho internacional y las resoluciones de este Consejo de Seguridad. Como ha recordado el señor secretario general, este Consejo es el órgano al que le compete la responsabilidad primordial de mantener la paz y seguridad internacionales y corresponde a sus miembros actuar con unidad en el cumplimiento de esa responsabilidad. El Perú se suma al urgente llamado del secretario general a todos los Estados miembros
member
a
states
actuar con
to
moderación
act with
en estas
restraint in
peligrosas
these dangerous
circunstancias
circumstances
y a evitar
and to
cualquier
avoid
acto que pueda
any
escalar la
act which
situación
could
y
escalate the
empeorar
situation
el
and
sufrimiento
worsen the
del pueblo
suffering of the
sirio.
Syrian people.
Mi delegación
My
reafirma
delegation
su
reaffirms its
compromiso para
commitment
seguir
to continue
trabajando
working
por alcanzar
in
una
order
paz
to achieve
sostenible en
sustainable
Siria,
peace in Syria,
garantizar la
to
protección de
guarantee
la población
protection for the
civil,
civilian
la no
population,
impunidad
and to
de los
ensure that there
crímenes
is no
atroces
impunity
y
for
promover la
atrocious
distensión.
crimes, as well as to help
Muchas gracias.
diffuse the
Retomo ahora mis
situation.
funciones
Thank
como
you.
presidente del
I now
Consejo de
resume my
Seguridad.
function as President of the
La
Security Council.
representante del
The
Reino Unido
representative
ha
of the
pedido
United
la
Kingdom
palabra
has
para
asked for the
formular
floor
una nueva
to
declaración.
make a
Le doy la
new
palabra.
statement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's actually a right of reply, if I may, to the Bolivian ambassador's points about the United Kingdom. Mr. President, we have no doubt about UK sovereignty over the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands and surrounding maritime areas. Successive British governments have made clear that sovereignty will not be transferred against the Falkland Islands' wishes. The Falkland Islanders voted overwhelmingly to maintain their current constitutional arrangements with the UK. Turning to the Chagos, Mr. President, the United Kingdom is participating in the proceedings before the ICJ, even as we disagree with jurisdiction in this case. Thank you.
Le doy las gracias a la representante del Reino Unido por su declaración. El representante de Bolivia ha solicitado la palabra para hacer una declaración adicional. Le doy la palabra.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Voy a ser muy breve. Voy a limitarme a leer lo que dice la declaración especial sobre la cuestión de las Islas Malvinas, firmada por todas las jefas y jefes de Estado y de Gobierno de América Latina y el Caribe. Dice así: los jefes de Estado y de Gobierno reiteran su más firme respaldo a los legítimos derechos de la República Argentina en la disputa de soberanía sobre las Islas Malvinas, Georgias del Sur y Sandwich del Sur y los espacios marítimos circundantes, y el permanente interés de los países de la región en que los gobiernos de la República Argentina y del Reino Unido de Gran Bretaña e Irlanda del Norte reanuden las negociaciones a fin de encontrar a la mayor brevedad posible una solución pacífica a dicha disputa de conformidad a la resolución 2065 de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas y otras pertinentes. Muchas gracias,
Le doy las gracias al representante de Bolivia por su declaración. Doy ahora la palabra al representante de la República Árabe Siria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you.
وأرحب بتواجد السيد الأمين العام معنا اليوم في هذه اللحظات الهامة من تاريخ وعمل مجلس الأمن. لقد حذر السيد الأمين العام في بيانه الهام أمس من أن الحرب الباردة قد عادت، وهذا صحيح، ونتفق كلنا على وجاهة هذا الكلام. وعلينا أن نتذكر في هذه المناسبة من الذي أطلق عودة فلسفة الحرب الباردة. طبعا كلنا نتذكر أنه بعد انهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي سابقا ظهرت كتب فلسفية في هذه البلاد كتبها شخص يدعى فرانسيس فوكوياما الذي ألف كتابا بعنوان نهاية التاريخ، وتلاه شخص آخر مفكر أمريكي آخر اسمه سامويل هانتينغتون فألف كتابا عنوانه صراع الحضارات. هذان الكتابان أسسا لعودة فلسفة الحرب الباردة، لأن مضمون هذين الكتابين كان: يا شعوب العالم، إما أن تسلكوا النهج الأمريكي وتتبعوا الإرادة الأمريكية، أو سنعتدي عليكم. يعني بالمثل الأمريكي الشائع: my way or the highway. هكذا عادت أجواء فلسفة الحرب
الباردة. Says the speaker, as you say in the United States.
الكذب لا يفيد شيئا أيها السادة. الكذب لا يفيد شيئا. يفيد صاحبه مرة واحدة. الكذب يخدع لمرة واحدة فقط. أما عندما يتكرر يصبح هذا الكذب مكشوفا وفاضحا لصاحبه.
When the lies keep being repeated, well, that person who lies only
تحدث زميلي السفير الفرنسي عن أنه هو وبريطانيا والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية قاموا بالعدوان على بلادي باسم المجتمع الدولي. هيك قال لا كوميونيتي انترناسيونال. أنا أريد أن أستفسر عن أي مجتمع دولي يتحدث زميلي السفير الفرنسي. هل يتحدث عن مجتمع دولي موجود؟ فعلا؟ هل هذا المجتمع الدولي الذي تمثلونه أنتم وافق على أن تقوم هذه الحكومات الثلاث بالعدوان على بلادي؟ هل حصلت هذه الحكومات الثلاث على تفويض من ارتكاب العدوان على بلادي؟
Your governments receive a mandate from this organization from this international community to attack my country?
الأمريكية والبريطانية والفرنسي
my American and French
أنهم
and British
قصفوا مراكز إنتاج مواد كيميائية في سوريا.
claimed
هيك قال
that they have bombed
إذا كانت حكومات هذه الدول الثلاث تعرف مواقع هذه المراكز التي ادعوا أنهم قصفوها، فلماذا لم يشاطروا هذه المعلومات مع منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية؟ ولماذا لم يشاطروا هذه المعلومات مع فريق التحقيق الموجود في دمشق قبل أن يرتكبوا عدوانهم على بلاد؟
The fact-finding mission present
هذا
in
سؤال.
Damascus before attacking my country. It's just a question
بالمناسبة
to you.
أؤكد لكم جميعا على وصول وفد من بعثة تقصي الحقائق التابعة لمنظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية إلى دمشق ظهر اليوم. طبعا تم تأخير وصول الوفد من بيروت إلى دمشق لأسباب غير معروفة لمدة يوم كامل إلى أن حدث العدوان. وكأن هناك من أوعز لهذا الفريق أن لا يتجه إلى دمشق أمس قبل حدوث العدوان بانتظار أن يحدث العدوان. المهم أن الوفد وصل إلى دمشق ظهر اليوم وسيعقد بناء على طلبه اجتماعا تشاوريا الساعة 7 مساء يعني بعد ساعتين بتوقيت دمشق مع الجانب السوري. وحكومة بلادي ستقدم كل المساعدة اللازمة للوفد لإنجاح مهمته. بناء مركز البحوث العلمية في برزة أيها السادة الذي تم قصفه من قبل العدوان الثلاثي. هذا البناء زاره فريق من الOPCW ومنظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية مرتين في العام الماضي وفتشوه وقدموا لنا وثيقة رسمية أنه لا يوجد أي نشاط كيماوي في هذا المركز بموجب التزامات سوريا تجاه منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية. طيب إذا خبراء منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية سلمونا وثيقة رسمية في العام الماضي أن هذا المركز مركز برزة للبحوث العلمية ليس فيه أي أنشطة كيماوية تخالف التزاماتنا بموجب قضيتنا في منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيماوية.
chemical activity that is in contravention to our obligations vis-à-vis the OPCW. How do you reconcile that with what we've heard this morning?
How
do you reconcile that with all these accusations and the claims that this aggression was targeted a chemical weapons production
الزميلة الأمريكية قالت أن وقت الحديث انتهى بالأمس.
The colleague from the United States said the time for discussion is over. It was over yesterday. Well, then what are we doing today as diplomats in the Security Council? Our mission here is to speak, is to explain what happened, to shed light on all the issues.
كيف انتهى وقت الحديث؟ وقت الحديث لا ينتهي بالنسبة للدبلوماسيين في مجلس الأمن. إذا كان الهدف هو منع العدوان.
How can we state that the discussion is over? No, the discussion is continuing
here.
If the idea is to put an end to aggressions of the discussion, if the idea is to implement the provisions of the Charter and international law, that is why we're here.
تحدث الزميلان البريطاني والفرنسي عن وجود خطة عمل.
The British and French
ودعوا
colleagues
السيد
spoke
الأمين
of
العام
a
إلى
plan of action
إعمالها
and have invited
قبل
the
أن
Secretary
يتفق
General to
بشأنها
implement
مجلس
that plan
الأمن
of action.
والحكومة السورية.
Before
وخطة العمل عجيبة وغريبة.
And the Syrian government agreed to that plan of action. This plan of action, or they spoke of it before the Council authorized that plan of action. It's a very strange plan of action. But I would like to present a counter plan of action. We assume that this should have been one of the plans of action that should have been presented today. First of all, read the provisions of the United Nations Charter. Define and recall the responsibility of these three states in maintaining international peace and security rather than threatening it. I have three versions of the Charter, two in English, one in French. Perhaps these three states should reread what the Charter actually states.
التوقف الفوري عن تقديم هذه الدول كل أشكال الدعم للمجموعات الإرهابية المسلحة في بلاد.
Three states to immediately stop supporting the armed terrorist groups active in my
التوقف عن
country.
الكذب وفبركة الادعاءات لتبرير عدوان هذه الدول الثلاث المستمر على بلاد سوريا.
And to the fabrication of facts to justify the aggression against my country. Fourth, these three states should realize that after 7 years of a terrorist war that was imposed on my country, a war carried out by these three countries and their agents in the region,
ولن تكسر إرادتنا وتصميمنا على القضاء على إرهابكم.
their bombs will not weaken our determination to defeat and destroy your terrorists. This will not prevent the Syrian people to decide on their own political future without foreign intervention. And I will repeat this for 1,000th time. The Syrian people will not allow any foreign intervention to define our future. I promised you yesterday that we will not remain inactive in the face of any aggression, and we kept our promise. And I will explain how we've kept our
وهنا
promise.
اسمحوا لي أن أتوجه بكلامي إلى الأعضاء الملتزمين بالشرعية الدولية قائلا لهم بأن الجمهورية العربية السورية وحلفائها وأصدقائها وهم كثر يتكفلون بالرد على العدوان الغاشم الذي وقع صباح اليوم على بلادي. أما ما نطلبه منكم اليوم أنتم كدبلوماسيين كسفراء أيها الملتزمون بالشرعية الدولية وبالميثاق، فهو أن تدعو الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا وفرنسا لقراءة أحكام الميثاق وما تضمنه من أحكام حول احترام سيادة الدول والامتناع عن استخدام القوة في مضمار العلاقات الدولية. لعل حكومات هذه الدول الثلاث تدرك ولو لمرة واحدة أن مهمتها في هذا المجلس هي الحفاظ على السلم والأمن الدوليين وليس تقويضهما. وكما قلت لكم قبل قليل لدي 3 نسخ من الميثاق وأطلب من الأمانة أن تسلمها لهذه الوفود كي تتثقف بأحكامها في غابة طغيانها
to
وجهلها.
distribute them to the three delegations so that they could maybe enlighten themselves in their
في انتهاك سافر لمبادئ القانون الدولي وأحكام ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، نفذت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا وفرنسا في الساعة 3:55 من فجر اليوم السبت 14/4/2018 بتوقيت دمشق عدوانا غادرا وسافرا على الجمهورية العربية السورية. تجسد هذا العدوان بإطلاق حوالي 110 صواريخ باتجاه أراضي الجمهورية العربية السورية في العاصمة دمشق ومدن ومناطق سورية أخرى. 110 صواريخ. وردا على هذا العدوان الغاشم مارست الجمهورية العربية السورية حقها الشرعي بموجب المادة 51 من الميثاق في الدفاع عن النفس وصد العدوان الآثم، حيث تصدت منظومات الدفاع الجوي السورية بصواريخ العدوان الثلاثي، في حين تمكن بعض هذه الصواريخ من إصابة أحد مباني مركز البحوث العلمية في منطقة برز في العاصمة دمشق، وليس خارج العاصمة دمشق، في العاصمة دمشق، وهو مركز يضم مركزا تعليميا ومخابر علمية. واقتصرت الأضرار على الماديات كما تم حرف مسار الصواريخ اللطيفة والذكية والحديثة التي استهدفت موقعا عسكريا قرب مدينة حمص، فأدى انفجار أحدها إلى إصابة 3 مدنيين بجروح. لقد مهدت حكومات هذه الدول لعدوانها الغاشم بإصدار تصريحات عدوانية من كبار مسؤوليها تقول فيها ضمنا أن ذريعتها الوحيدة لمنع تقدم الجيش العربي السوري في مواجهة الجماعات الإرهابية المسلحة هي مزاعم استخدام الأسلحة الكيميائية. وبالفعل وصلت توجيهات هؤلاء المعتدين للمجموعات الإرهابية المسلحة، فعملت هذه المجموعات في سباق مع الزمن على فبركة مسرحية استخدام المواد الكيميائية في دوما، واستجلبت شهود الزور وتلاعبت في مسرح الجريمة المزعوم كما فعلت سابقا، فأعدت بذلك الذريعة لشن هذا العدوان السافر الذي لا يمكن تفسيره إلا بأن المعتدي الأصيل وهو الولايات المتحدة بريطانيا وفرنسا قد قررت التدخل بشكل مباشر انتقاما لهزيمة أذرعه الإرهابية الوكيلة في الغوطة. بالمناسبة أيها السادة، تم إلقاء القبض على أولئك الذين فبركوا مشهد استخدام الكيماوي في الغوطة واعترفوا على شاشات التلفزة بأنهم فبركوا هذه القصة من أولها إلى آخرها، ولدينا الفيلم في حال رغبت الرئاسة بالحصول عليه. إنني ألفت عنايتكم أيها السادة أيها الملتزمون بالميثاق والشرعية الدولية إلى أن العدوان السافر قد وجه رسالة جديدة من هؤلاء الثلاثة المعتدين إلى المجموعات الإرهابية لكي تتمادى في استخدام السلاح الكيماوي مستقبلا وفي جرائمها الإرهابية، ليس ضد المدنيين السوريين فحسب، بل في جرائمها التي ستطال بلدانا أخرى. وقد نبهناكم في 146 رسالة 146 رسالة إلى وجود مشاريع وخطط للمجموعات الإرهابية لاستخدام السلاح الكيماوي في سوريا. 146 رسالة موجودة في عهدتكم وعهدة الأمان العام. واليوم يحاول البعض أن يكتشف الدولاب من جديد ويعرف جنس الملائكة. تعلمون جميعا أيها السادة أن هذا العدوان قد تزامن مع وصول بعثة التحقيق التابعة لمنظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيميائية إلى بلاد سوريا بناء على طلب من حكومة بلاده، وذلك للتحقيق في الهجوم الكيميائي المزعوم في دوما. وبالمحصلة الطبيعي فإن الرسالة الأساسية التي وجهها هؤلاء المعتدون لكم وللعالم بأسره أنهم لا يقيمون وزنا لولايتكم كأعضاء في مجلس الأمن، ولا يريدون تحقيقا شفافا ومهنيا، وإنما يسعون إلى إعاقة عمل البحث واستباق نتائجها والضغط عليها في محاولة التغطية على أكاذيبهم وفبركاتهم والحيلولة دون فضلها، تماما كما كان قد حصل قبل 6 سنوات في العام 2013 مع الدكتور سيلستروم عندما كان في طريقه من دمشق إلى خان العسل، كما شرحت لكم في بيان سابق.
This aggression, this morning's aggression, this attack, it did not attack just Syria. It was not just an attack on Syria. As my very dear friend, the representative of Bolivia, said, this is an attack against international law, against the Security Council, against the Charter, an attack against the 193 members of this organization. Washington and London and Paris's attempts to make the fact-finding mission fail is rather systematic. Even if these three parties claim to be working alongside with these groups, at the same time they use pressure behind the closed doors of this organization so that these groups and these committees do not carry out the mandates for which they were established. We recall what took place with the Iraq, Libya, and in Africa with the investigatory commissions. None of those inspections were successful. If there's blackmail, it's impossible. To the three aggressors, I say that you are liars, you are spoilers, you're hypocrites, you're attempting to see failure in actions of this organization which do not pursue your interests. You've tried to undermine the efforts of the investigative bodies. You need only look at Africa, Syria, Libya, Angola, Yugoslavia. All of that is proof that you do not do what you say you are doing. You have exhausted the agendas of this Security Council by attempting to divert its attention, and you have exploited the Council to pursue your policy of interference and of colonialism. Yesterday, in the U.S. press and in the press in the West, the main theme was the lie and treachery in this campaign, which was already claiming success. The air defense system of my country countered with a great deal of bravery the attack on my country. 100 missiles were destroyed. They did not reach their target, and yet at the same time, the American Minister of Defense, military chief, spoke to the American press and international press and were extremely pleased. They weren't able actually to answer many of the questions, and it was rather pitiful to see these two men standing before the press, unable to respond to the legitimate questions of a journalist.
وعن مخاطر مثل هذه الضربة على حياة المدنيين نتيجة انتشار وتسرب هذه المواد المزعومة.
In their attempt to target chemical weapons facilities, and was this actually a danger for the civilians if the chemical weapons spread? They were unable to respond to that question. And I quote, you said here that you have no proof that the Syrian government was responsible for the attack in Ghouta. So what happened in the past few hours? What made you change your mind?
كان جوابه إنه خلال هذه الساعات حصل على تأكيد من الأجهزة الاستخبارات.
His answer was that he'd received confirmation from the intelligence services. The Syrian Arab Republic firmly condemns this tripartite attack, which once again shows indisputably that they pay no attention to international law, even though they say they do repeatedly. These countries have shown their conviction for the law of the jungle and the law of the strongest at a time when they are permanent members of the Security Council, a body which is entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security, and to stop any aggression in accordance with international law. Syria is disgusted with the scandalous position of the heads of Qatar, who supported this aggression after they allowed planes to leave from the air bases in Qatar. It is not surprising that the small boys in the Qatari Emirates take that position. They have supported in a variety of ways the terrorist groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood and others to destabilize Arab countries, including Syria. The Syrian Arab Republic is asking the international community if it does indeed exist. We've heard a new definition of the international community. We demand that the international community and the Security Council condemn this attack, which will only further tension in the region. It is a threat to international peace and security throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are committed to international law, I call upon you to imagine with me this meeting where the Security Council would have decided, agreed on such an attack. I'm wondering what would be said. We have no legal basis for attacking Syria. We have no proof of the existence of this chemical weapons attack in Douma. But let's forget that, put that all aside. And in point of fact, we never really needed in any military action that we've carried out, we've never really needed international law. And then I'm just imagining this discussion. I'm imagining what this discussion would have been like yesterday. This military attack is necessary for us and for our allies, so that public opinion in our country can turn their eyes away from our own political scandals, and so that the Emirates in the Gulf pay the price for this. All of that to defend and protect the terrorism that we've seen for years in Syria. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias al representante de la República Árabe Siria por su declaración. Los miembros del Consejo tienen ante sí el documento S/18/355 que contiene el texto de un proyecto de resolución presentado por la Federación de Rusia. El Consejo está listo para someter a votación el proyecto de resolución que tiene ante sí. Someteré ahora a votación el proyecto de resolución. Quienes estén a favor del proyecto de resolución que figura en el documento S/2018/355, sírvanse levantar la mano. En contra.
Those against?
Abstenciones.
Abstentions?
El resultado de la votación es el siguiente. Votos a favor, 3. Votos en contra, 8. Abstenciones, 4. El proyecto de resolución no ha sido aprobado por no haber obtenido el número de votos requerido. Daré ahora la palabra a aquellos miembros del Consejo que deseen formular declaraciones después de la votación. Doy la palabra al representante de Suecia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We voted against the draft resolution proposed by the Russian Federation because we believe that the language in the resolution was unbalanced, not comprehensive, and it did not cover the entirety of our concerns related to the current situation. At the same time, we agree with the Secretary General that there is an obligation that actions be consistent with the Charter of the UN and with international law in general. In our national statement delivered earlier today, we explained our view on the current situation in Syria, and we condemned the use of chemical weapons and the many other flagrant violations of international law in Syria. We also underlined the need for a sustainable political solution. We once again reiterate that, as members of the Security Council, we need to unite and exercise our responsibility in relation to the situation in Syria. If there is any encouragement today, Mr. President, it is that everyone around this table seem to insist on a sustainable political solution as the only way to end the suffering of the Syrian population. So we reiterate our full support for the UN political process, which now urgently needs to be reinvigorated, including through strong support for the efforts of Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al representante de Suecia por su declaración y doy la palabra al representante de Etiopía.
Thank you, Mr. President. We want to explain why we abstained on the draft proposed by Russia. We did so not because the draft doesn't contain a lot of truth. It does. Not because it does not adhere to principles that we should all adhere to. It does. We abstained on pragmatic ground. We know, even if it had received 9 votes, it would have been vetoed. Thus, it would have had only symbolic value. Even that is not without value, though. But for us, what's critical now is to diffuse tension and avoid the situation spiraling out of control. We wish to play a constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Etiopía por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Kazajstán.
Mr. President, Kazakhstan has abstained from voting on the resolution considered today because we believe that all disputes between states should be resolved by peaceful dialogue and constructive negotiations on the basis of equal responsibility for peace and security. As I have already mentioned in my statement, we call for all parties to refrain from any actions that can aggravate further the tensions and lead the situation to a spiraling out of control from which we would need to retract back. I thank you.
Agradezco al representante de Kazajstán por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Guinea Ecuatorial.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Nuestra abstención refleja la frustración de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial por la situación a la que hemos llegado a falta de la adopción de un mecanismo de investigación, de seguimiento y de atribución de responsabilidades sobre el uso de armas químicas. Con esta abstención queremos hacer un llamamiento para que retomemos la iniciativa de la preparación de una resolución que pueda ser consensuada para el establecimiento de este mecanismo y poder evitar actos como los que conocimos ayer. En este sentido, queremos recordar la iniciativa que había tomado Suecia y que había sido respaldada por los países de A10, o sea, mejor dicho, de E10, y que podamos ya introducir las reformas que sean necesarias en este proyecto de resolución a fin de que se pueda adoptar por consenso y establecer ese mecanismo bajo los auspicios del secretario general de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Le agradezco al representante de Guinea Ecuatorial por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Francia.
Monsieur le Président, le projet de résolution présenté par la Russie vient d'être clairement rejeté. Ce vote envoie un message clair sur la compréhension par les membres du Conseil de sécurité des motivations et des objectifs de nos actions d'hier.
The aims of our action yesterday, the need for these actions, their proportional and targeted nature were recognized. And what's most important, no one contests the fact that use of chemical weapons cannot be tolerated and must be deterred. That is essential. Now it's important for us to look toward the future. As I just said earlier, these strikes are a necessary response in the service of law and in the service of our policy to put an end to the Syrian tragedy. This is why, together with our British and U.S. colleagues, we will be presenting a draft resolution on the political, chemical, and humanitarian tracks of the Syrian dossier in order to achieve a lasting solution to the conflict. France will work with all the members of the Security Council for this purpose. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands has voted against the draft resolution proposed by the Russian Federation. It's because this draft does not provide for the action that the Security Council so urgently needs to take after the use of chemical weapons in Syria. It ignores the very essence of what the Security Council needs to do. This Council should act and condemn the use of chemical weapons in Syria, protect the Syrian people, and hold accountable those responsible. And this resolution does none of this. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Le agradezco a la representante de Países Bajos por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. The state of Kuwait voted against the draft resolution at the time where we reiterate our adherence to the principles and purposes of the UN Charter that provide for the non-use of force, of threat of, and the use of peaceful means to settle disputes. Yesterday's use of force was a result of obstructing the will of the international community and particularly obstructing the effort and determination of the Security Council to take measures that were available to put an end to the continued use of internationally prohibited chemical weapons in Syria. This is a flagrant violation of Resolution 2118 that unequivocally expressed the determination of the Council to take action under Chapter 7 of the Charter in the case that one or more parties do not comply with the provisions and in case of the continued use of chemical weapons in Syria. The Council needs to regain its unity and shoulder its responsibilities towards the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with the UN Charter. It must agree on a new independent, impartial and professional mechanism to investigate any use of chemical weapons that would identify those who are responsible for those crimes and hold them to account and make sure they do not enjoy impunity. We call for intensified efforts and a return to the political track under the auspices of the UN to reach a peaceful settlement of the crisis in accordance with Geneva I Communique of 2012 and Resolution 2254. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le doy las gracias al representante de Kuwait por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de China.
Thank you, Mr. President. As all know, China has always opposed the use of force in international relations. We advocate the respect of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of all countries. Any unilateral military action bypassing the Security Council runs counter to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and violates the principles of international law and the basic norms governing international relations and will further complicate the Syrian issue. Based on the above principled position, China voted in favor of the draft resolution put forward by the Russian Federation. I would like to emphasize here that political settlement is the only viable way to solve the Syrian issue. China urges the relevant parties to keep calm, exercise restraint, and return to the framework of international law and resolve the issues through dialogue and negotiation. We support the role of the UN as main channel for mediation, and we will make unremitting efforts for the political settlement of the Syrian issue together with the international community. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de China por su declaración y le doy la palabra al representante de la Federación de Rusia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today is a day when the Security Council and the international community must raise its voice in favor of peace, security, the UN Charter, and international law. Each one of the delegations in this room represents a sovereign state. And no one should try to urge them or dictate to them how to interpret international law, the UN Charter, and how to exercise their own conscience. We will never have any qualms to vote as dictated by international law, the UN Charter, our conscience, and law. Today's meeting confirms that the United States, Great Britain, and France, permanent members of the Security Council, continue to put international politics and diplomacy in the realm of myth-making. Myths invented in London, Paris, and Washington. This is a dangerous aberration. It is a diplomacy of myth-making, of hypocrisy, of falsehoods, and of substitution of ideas and notions. If we continue down this path, we'll soon reach the diplomacy of the absurd. You're creating these myths, and then you're forcing everyone to try to believe in these myths. We put facts and contrary to your myths and the picture of what is actually taking place in real life. But you are not seeing this. You're not hearing this. You don't want to see it. You're simply disregarding what we are telling you. You have invented a legend about this constant resolution that is being put forward and you provoke Russia to veto it so as to present this whole situation in a favorable light. You distort international law by substituting important notions, concepts. You are engaged in open hypocrisy. You're demanding a conduct of an investigation. Even before the investigation, you appoint those who are guilty and punish them. Why didn't you wait for the outcome of the investigation which you yourself called for? The Security Council is in a state of paralysis because of you, because of your constant attempts to hoodwink the international community. You're not only placing yourselves above international law, but you're trying to rewrite international law. You contravene international law and you contravene international law while trying to convince everyone that your actions are legitimate. The representative of the United Kingdom to justify the airstrikes pointed to 3 reasons based on the concept of humanitarian intervention. Now, you're trying to substitute the UN Charter for this. This is precisely, we and other countries did not support that concept in the past and continue not to support it now, because we don't want this to become a justification for your crime. Once again, we demand immediate stop to aggression and refrain from the illegal use of force in the future. Today, you once again demonstrated to the entire world your illicit games,
the
Soviet times, there was a brochure which was called Whence the Threat of Peace Comes From. In that brochure, it spoke of military preparations by Washington and the NATO countries. Nothing has changed. That is precisely whence the threat of to peace continues to come from. Just look at what is being said and which drums of war are being beaten in Washington. Covering, using the cover of hypocrisy and the interest in democracy and human rights. Now, this is from Note 507, and I can't give you a list of all these things that in that note. It's too long. I can mention other examples about how the French president expressed an interest in the investigation in Duma and was ready to send French experts in his conversations with President Putin. Then all of a sudden that just evaporated because a different algorithm was launched. That's quite obvious. Today is a very sad day, Mr. President. It's a sad day for the world, for the UN, for its charter, which was blatantly violated. For the Security Council also, which has shirked its responsibilities. I would like to believe that we will not see a day that is worse than today. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al representante de la Federación de Rusia por su declaración. Formularé ahora una nueva declaración en mi calidad de representante del Perú. El Perú ha votado en abstención debido a que consideramos que el proyecto no reflejaba adecuadamente la necesidad de garantizar la rendición de cuentas correspondiente al empleo de armas químicas en todo el territorio sirio. Asimismo, porque el lenguaje de la misma es desbalanceado y no contribuye a recuperar la unidad de este Consejo necesaria para abordar en forma integral los acontecimientos en Siria. Vuelvo a asumir la función de presidente del Consejo. La delegación del Reino Unido ha solicitado la palabra para hacer una nueva declaración. Le doy la palabra.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think it's obvious why we voted against the resolution. We support completely what the French representative laid out about next steps, and we will work tirelessly to that objective, along with partners on the Council. Mr. President, the Russian ambassador referred to myths. These are not our myths, Mr. President. The way forward in the Council has been blocked. The second of our own criteria for taking this action on an exceptional basis that it must be objectively clear there is no practicable alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. Mr. President, in the 113 meetings of this Council on Syria, I think that has been demonstrated absolutely crystally clear. The United Kingdom believes that it cannot be illegal to prevent the use of force to save lives in such numbers as we have seen in Syria. The reason we took this action, Mr. President, our legal basis was that of humanitarian intervention. We believe that is wholly within the principles and purposes of the United Nations. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante del Reino Unido por su declaración. El representante de la República Árabe Siria ha solicitado la palabra para formular una nueva declaración. Le doy la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for requesting the floor once again. Mr. President, the scene that we just witnessed is quite sad. In this council, there are those who prefer
to overlook and not see a big elephant that we've spoken of before. The elephant is namely a direct military occupation of 1/3 of my country's territory. A military occupation, an American direct military occupation of 1/3 of our territory. However, there are those who speak of small, minor details, and they think that they are pivotal. The political scene is way more dangerous than this. We are a state whose sovereignty has been violated by a permanent member of this council. This is the true scene, and not the allegations or a film by the White Helmets. It is a terrorist organization established by the British intelligence. We need to focus on the main scene here. Some would claim that they are fighting ISIL in Syria and Iraq. However, they have given air cover for ISIL. Wherever we make advances against ISIL, US, British, and French warplanes bombard our military sites so that we would not achieve victory against ISIL. However, this failed. We were able to achieve victory against ISIL with our brothers in Iraq in 3 years and not in 50 years as former President Obama predicted. We understand that the capitals of the 3 countries that launched the aggression have a frustration. Some colleagues who voted against the Russian draft resolution said that they support political settlement. We tell them now, after their shameful vote against the draft resolution, that those who voted against the draft resolution are no longer partners of the Syrian government in any political settlement process. The British ambassador explained things about the Malvinas Islands. This testimony uncovers the facts about imperialistic policies of Britain. Madam Ambassador, I am actually the rapporteur of the C-24 on the decolonization, and I work under the agenda of the UN and the agenda of the Secretary General. And my job and my colleagues in C-24 is to end colonization in this world, and the Malvinas is on the list of territories that do not enjoy independence. We work in accordance with the UN agenda to end the British occupation of the Malvinas. As for my colleague, the ambassador of Kuwait, I would like to remind him, and he is well aware, and his government knows, that when my country participated in the liberation of Kuwait, we did not justify our principled position to the people of Kuwait. It was based on our principles. We did not need draft resolutions or meetings or any tripartite aggression. We did not look into the provisions of the Charter, and we did not undermine our national obligation to our brothers in Kuwait, and we did not join any bloc that was aggressive to Kuwait. We fulfilled our national duty towards our brothers in the state of Kuwait. He would also recall, the ambassador of Kuwait, that at the time my country could have played a different role and could have negatively impacted the peace and security, stability of Kuwait. But we choose not to do so.
We acted upon a national principle position that is not subject to negotiation or discussion. I thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco al representante de la República Árabe Siria por su declaración. No hay más oradores inscritos en la lista. Se levanta la sesión.